Welcome to the Disability Sport Info Show, the podcast that explores academic knowledge about disability sport. My name is Dr. Chris Brown, and I'm an academic with an expertise in disability sport. Each episode, I focus on a specific topic of disability sport and speak to academic experts to understand the area in more depth. So, join me and listen to the Disability Sport Info Show to get an expert view on disability sport. Hello listener, welcome to the Disability Sport Info Show. It's great to have you with me. This is a bumper episode that focuses on sport participation in action for disabled people. We will hear from a range of experts from across the globe in our effort to understand how sport participation for disabled people works in practice. First, Professor Ruth Jeans discusses the role of voluntary sports clubs in the grassroots sport participation of disabled people. I then speak to Keon Richardson to explore coaching in grassroots disability sport. My third discussion is with Dr. Jess Macbeth, who considers visually impaired sport. I then speak with Dr. Tony Williams to explore sport participation for people with physical impairments. We then take a virtual trip to Sweden to chat with Dr. Erik Svenelöv about sport participation and physical activity experiences of individuals with an intellectual impairment. My penultimate discussion is with Rebecca Foster, MBE, and Chris Price to assess the sport experiences of deaf and hearing impaired individuals. Finally, I speak with Ali Jawad to discuss the Accessercise fitness app that has been specifically designed for people with impairments. All of the episodes featured in this special edition of the podcast are available as standalone episodes on the Disability Sport Info Buzzsprout podcast site. Check them out if you have a specific interest or are time constrained. If you're still with me, thanks for staying. You're in for a treat. By the end of the episode, you will be familiar with the experiences of disabled people's sport participation. First up is Professor Ruth Jeans to discuss the role of voluntary sports clubs in disabled people's sport participation. Ruth, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to chatting to you about voluntary sports clubs. To what extent do voluntary sport clubs provide sport participation opportunities for disabled people?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks for offering the opportunity to chat about this today. It's a subject I'm really passionate about. I think in terms of voluntary sports clubs, the amount that they are able to provide opportunities for people with disabilities, it just really varies across countries, across different sports, across sort of different contexts. But particularly if we look at my context, which is in Australia, and sort of looking at, the majority of sport participation, particularly for young people, takes place within a community sport and voluntary sport club context. There's been some key sort of policy agendas here over the last 15, 20 years, which have really looked at sort of trying to mainstream opportunities for people with disabilities. So a lot of emphasis has been put on traditional voluntary sports clubs being able to provide those opportunities for people with disabilities. And I think they've probably achieved that to varying extents. Some sports, some clubs have really embraced it and offer some really great opportunities for people with disabilities. Others haven't engaged that much, and I think it's still, if you just sort of look at so I live in just outside of Melbourne, and if I look in my local area and think, okay, if I want to find opportunities for people with disabilities amongst the voluntary sports clubs locally, there'd be very few opportunities available within my immediate area. Voluntary sports clubs are so potentially important for providing these opportunities, but it's still really lacking. And I guess one of the other things I'd say as well is in terms of who voluntary sports clubs provide opportunities for. So some might cater for certain people with disabilities. Over here, participation in sort of all abilities competitions is quite popular, which really focuses on providing provision for people with intellectual disabilities. But there would be less opportunity within mainstream clubs for, say, people with visual impairments, people with physical disabilities. So it's a real mix, sort of depending on the sport, the area that you live in, I think, and the breadth of disability that a voluntary sports club can cater for as well.
Okay, lots of interesting points raised there. So you said there's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the effectiveness of some of the clubs, and we discussed about the locality, the sport itself, the knowledge of the club in terms of disability, etc., or the impairment group. So what would you say is the key kind of characteristics or traits that separate clubs which are effective and clubs which are not effective at providing opportunities?
We've done quite a lot of research in this space, myself and colleagues, looking at how community sports clubs cater for diversity. And the key thing we found where clubs do well in this space, and particularly in relation to people with disabilities, is they nearly always have an individual champion. They've got a person that's absolutely passionate about a particular area, providing opportunities for people that are of difference, people with disabilities, whoever it might be. And they have gone all out to make sure that their club provides opportunities for them. And I think that sort of time and time again, we kept sort of seeing that in the studies we've done, that this one person, and often they might be a parent of a child with a disability who, you know, just wants their child to be able to play sport, wants them to be able to get engaged in sport in their local community, have gone to their local club and found that there's no provision there. So said, okay, well, we'll set this up and we'll get this going. So those people are often, they're the ones that plant the seed. They then often have the networks into sort of organisations that work with people with disabilities or within, say, special education, and are able to recruit sort of young people into the clubs as well through those networks. But they'll also be the ones that are sort of looking at, well, how can I chase funding? How can I go to my local government? How can I go to my sporting association? And they're the ones like looking at the grant applications. They're applying for funding for equipment, for modifications, all those sorts of things. And from that, they're able to sort of build a kind of a platform that enables some level of sustainable provision within the clubs. So I think that's sort of been really key in distinguishing a club that's kind of effective in this space to ones that perhaps don't offer that much provision or don't offer any at all. I think other examples where we've sort of seen provision being developed, it can be off the back of a particular funding stream that comes from a governing body, and the sort of sports associations over here, as they're known, and they might have a drive on sort of developing opportunities for people with disabilities. They give short-term funding to develop projects, and from this we sometimes see things like, you know, a come and try or a 6-week program for people with disabilities to come and try the sport, but the kind of the infrastructure and the impetus within the club isn't necessarily there, so it doesn't continue after that 6 weeks. So those kind of individuals that are just so passionate about this space just makes such a difference into how a club sees people with disability, how much they think it's important, how much they want to engage in the space.
Okay, so it seems there has to be, or at least at the beginning, you might have to have an advocate or a kind of a key champion, as you say, to really drive the work. From what you're telling me, it seems that if we don't have that individual or few people who are in the club who are passionate, it's unlikely there is an inclusive culture already existing to enable, specifically looking at people with disabilities, participation to occur.
It takes that person to really push it to the forefront of the agenda. And what we kind of found, as you don't expect and understand, you know, voluntary sports clubs are busy places. They're under pressure with limited capacity and volunteers. And for many, I think catering to any sort of dimension of diversity can seem daunting. It can seem as something that they don't have the resources to do. I think that's particularly the case for people with disabilities, where there's a certain fear about, well, how do we actually do this, and what do we need to do, and how do we adjust, and what modifications do we need to make? And we don't have the expertise to do that, or the time to get the expertise. I think there's sort of this concern within clubs that they can't cater effectively, and so they sort of stay away from it really, whereas that individual person can be the real kind of key element in flipping that mindset as well. What we sort of saw again is this sort of time and time again within clubs as well, was this kind of feeling that, say, providing opportunities for people with disabilities was kind of periphery to their core business. it wasn't necessarily what they were there to do. They saw their role very much as providing sports opportunities for the local community, for, competing in leagues and tournaments, and sort of ensuring that they were successful in those. And often developing a disability provision, a disability section, or integrating people with disabilities into those existing mainstream teams was just sort of seen as something that, like, well, okay, that's kind of nice to do, but it's not what we're here for. So it's still sort of see elements of a kind of resistance, I guess, in some ways, to really wanting to kind of engage in space. And again, that's not all clubs. I'm sort of generalizing a bit here, but where we sort of found clubs weren't engaging, those were typically kind of the reasons given, that we just don't have enough resources, we're just too busy, we just can't cater for diverse participants in our club structure. One of the other things as well that we sort of found from clubs that were and weren't engaged in this space was just there's quite a lot of sort of overarching policy in the area. There has been these drives and across different sports at different times to increase the number of people with disabilities participating, to look at how to develop more opportunities to support clubs better with this. What we sort of found was that policy climate's helpful, but without that individual person really kind of driving things forward, you kind of needed the two to meet together for opportunities really to come to fruition. The policy climate on its own wasn't enough to drive change in clubs and to get clubs to engage in the space. You needed those people that were really willing to take that on and to get involved and to grab that sort of policy agenda and say, okay, we're going to make that happen at my club.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think what you're saying, if you don't have those two strands meeting together, you're always going to get some sort of resistance in one shape or form. If it's just policy, it's probably just seen as a tick box exercise. And then once that policy is taken away or the funding is over, as you mentioned earlier, activity goes down. If it's just an individual on their own, they're potentially fighting against resistance or, people
Yes.
kind of not pulling in the same direction. So I think that is really key, what you said about the nexus between policy and inclusive culture.
Yeah, I think sort of, a lot of the time when we're looking at how do we address this, it's sort of seen as policy and initiatives as the top down is seen as the way forward, but we kind of forget about the bottom up drive here and the need to sort of say, okay, well, actually, can we sort of take a strengths-based perspective and look at where we've got interest and where we've got clubs that might have people that want to sort of get this started and work more sort of intensely with them rather than trying to push something down to a club that's just not willing or ready or wanting to do that.
That's something that's really shined through in some of the other conversations I've had with academic experts is the need to obviously engage with the population group, which is a very basic thing to actually talk about. But, sometimes we do get the policy just imposed from top down without consultation or collaboration with the grassroots.
Yeah, and I think that's so important on so many levels, and particularly in this space. So there's the actual consultation with the clubs themselves and their volunteer base and the coaches within that as well. And then also beyond that with people with disabilities, with young people with disabilities, actually sort of seeing, well, what do they want and what do they need from their club environment and what do they see can actually help make that happen. A lot of the research to date in the community sport side, community club side as well, hasn't really captured the voices of people with disabilities. I think, I've done bits in my own work, but I've also focused quite heavily on the experiences of coaches, of the sort of club volunteers and the kind of structures around to understand what's happening within the club structure. But the voices of people with disabilities and their experiences of community clubs is still really lacking, I think, in research in this space and greatly needed to sort of better understand, well, how do we take this forward? How do we enhance clubs to improve the experiences of people with disabilities?
Okay, so we've got the idea that you need to have that policy and you also need to have the inclusive culture if you want to utilise clubs effectively for participation in sport. Okay, so those that are involved, and are engaged and are trying to provide opportunities. How is it provided for disability in general? Because obviously disability is a very multifaceted concept and lots of different impairment groups, lots of different experiences. It manifests itself in very different ways. What is the kind of spread in terms of opportunities for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because, as you say, it is such a diverse population base, and that diversity has implications for what provisions needed to cater to that diversity. All the research I've been doing and the different clubs I've sort of been to and visited, there's none that I'd say absolutely cater fully across the inclusion spectrum. And I'm not sure whether a sort of voluntary club would have the capacity to do that necessarily. What I've seen here is that mainstream clubs in particular tend to only offer provision for people with disabilities that have intellectual disabilities by and large, and generally within the sort of mild to moderate categories of intellectual disabilities. And I think that obviously has to do with how much the sport and activity requires modification for that group of people. So generally what we've sort of found is, coaches might need some support on how to slightly modify how they coach. There might be some slight modifications needed to equipment to sort of, make certain coordination aspects easier, again, depending on the sport. So things like cricket, we might see slightly larger balls used and those sorts of things. But generally, the club doesn't have to do that much to cater for those individuals to participate. And sometimes even we'll have people with intellectual disabilities playing within the sort of mainstream teams, within the lower leagues of mainstream teams. So there is that sort of overlap with the existing provision. What was really rare for us to find in mainstream clubs, and it's not really surprising, but is people with more complex needs and complex disabilities. Like clubs just didn't have the capacity or the expertise really to accommodate people with more sort of complex needs. Depending on the sport, you'd sometimes find the clubs catering for people with physical disabilities. So within basketball in Australia, there's been a big drive on wheelchair basketball, and it's fairly common for a basketball association to have a wheelchair basketball league and to sort of be able to, and again, although there's sort of modifications there, the actual game doesn't change that much, the court doesn't change that much, the equipment doesn't change that much. So I think it's sort of it feels fairly familiar, and it doesn't seem like a long stretch to be able to cater for those individuals. Sensory disabilities are nearly entirely provided for within separate clubs. It's rare for that to be attached to mainstream provision, is what I've sort of found over here. It's very mixed between sort of fully separatist provision, which might often be community providers offering sports opportunities, particularly for those with more complex and diverse needs, right the way through to clubs offering, but barely sort of adjusting mainstream provision to offer for people with intellectual disabilities that can, more or less engage in a similar way to their mainstream participants. So it's a real kind of broad church, but I think what I've sort of definitely seen is clubs are more willing to engage with people with disabilities when they feel that they don't have to change very much. They don't have to sort of think of inclusion in a much broader way, in a broader spectrum. It's basically like, no, we can continue doing what we've always been doing, but great, we can include these people as well within that. Some of the coaches that we've sort of done research with as well definitely sort of feel that way in terms of, well, I don't have to adapt my coaching that much to work with this group of people, and therefore that's great and that's easy. So it's often the kind of least challenging pathway, I think, that clubs engage with in this space.
And in terms of that approach, kind of the least hassle, effectively, how much of that is influenced, do you think, by issues with relying on volunteers and time constraints and all that kind of thing, but also the inclusive culture maybe not being fully embedded or fully understood. What do you reckon is likely driving that?
I think it's sort of a combination of factors. I think it is kind of resourcing, and thinking about resourcing in voluntary clubs definitely limits capacity and what can be done. But as you say, I do think also it's sort of this idea of, well, thinking more broadly about inclusion and what inclusive participation actually looks like. And I also think part of it as well comes from the way the sporting associations also do frame their resources and the policy. And typically what we've seen here is where sports associations invest in this space, they do so very much with a kind of performance pathway in mind. So it's about how to foster clubs to support teams that can then feed into sort of state level competitions that can then feed into more elite levels as well. So it's sort of that kind of taking, what's considered the mainstream sporting pathway and just imposing it in community disability sport. And you kind of see the investment in there, as well as I sort of said about with wheelchair basketball, there's a clear elite pathway there. All abilities cricket's been another big sort of focus, particularly in Victoria where I live. And that's very much being developed by the sort of sporting association based on this idea of, well, we'll develop leagues, we'll have tournaments, we'll have a state level team, and sort of really focused on this kind of performance pathway, which I think as soon as that kind of happens and it's crafted on the idea of mainstream sport and what competitive mainstream sport should be doing, it just kind of closes down some of those ideas of wider inclusion, and it sort of stops us saying, well, okay, how can we make the most amount of people with the most diverse needs participate? And to do that, we might actually have to completely sort of change what cricket looks like for that group. But I don't think there's sort of a willingness or kind of desire to do that. It's like, no, how can we keep, again, sort of soccer or cricket or whatever sport it is, as it is for people with disabilities? It kind of gets limited, I think, in that way.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if this is fair, but it sounds to me like it is the customers, the individuals have to adapt rather than the sport adapting for them.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, and again, some of the good clubs that are really heavily engaged in this space will totally adapt how they actually offer their activity, and, will be very mindful of who they're working with and what the people that they're working with, what they want, what's going to suit them and their abilities, and they'll change. But in terms of the sort of the structures and systems that have been put in place to support disability sport, it's very much a sort of fixed way of engaging in that particular activity that's kind of recognised with small, modifications along the way. The other thing, and I think this is true of the UK as well, but certainly in Australia, the disability sport space is very chaotic. Sort of part of the research, we just tried to map all the different organisations, and a lot of clubs we spoke to and local government as well just sort of said that the area is so chaotic, it's quite hard to know when you're trying to get something going, who's the best people to connect with, and why should you connect with them, and should you connect with this group. So I think that's made it quite challenging, although there has been in the last sort of 5 years or so efforts made to try and coordinate and have an overarching national group that kind of brings all these different bodies together. I think for the club on the ground and those volunteers who are sort of thinking already, oh, this might be quite a challenging area to get into and we're not really sure how to best do it, it kind of makes it even harder, because it's like, oh gosh, well, I've no idea who I should be working with to take this area forward in my club.
Yeah, I think you're correct in terms of saying it's like that in the UK. I think lots of different organisations, lots of fragmentation, complexity, and like you said, that can create added issues for some of the clubs, perhaps. So if we're thinking about those individuals who are inactive, who don't participate in sport and maybe not even do much physical activity, how effective are clubs then for getting inactive disabled people to be participating in their sport?
I think that's a real challenge for clubs. I mean, I think it's a challenge for clubs regardless of whether the person has a disability or whatever. If someone hasn't been active, doesn't particularly have much of a sporting background, and if we think about people with disabilities and we look at literature that talks about their experiences in physical education, and generally it's not good, and if that person's been in a sort of special education setting, they might not have had that much access to regular physical education. If they've been in a mainstream school, may well have had poor experiences in physical education, so not that opportunity to build up that sort of skills and knowledge and capacity to engage in sport as much. For those people, jumping into a club is a huge step, and it's sort of an intimidating one. You know, you've got the sort of issue of starting an activity that you don't particularly know much about, but also going into an environment that you're not 100% sure whether it's going to be welcoming, whether it's going to be inclusive, whether it's going to be supportive. And, you know, particularly if you're working with coaches that have, you know, lots of coaching experience and sporting experience, but not that experience of working with people with disabilities, it's a lot of kind of ifs and concerns. And I know certainly sort of the research I've done with families and parents with children with disabilities, parents get really concerned about putting their child in a position, like quite rightly so, where they're not sure what sort of reception they're going to get and how inclusive and supportive that environment's going to be. So I think there's quite a lot of issues and barriers there for someone that hasn't been that active. And I think, again, it goes back to what we were sort of saying about how much a sports club or a sport overall is prepared to kind of modify what they do and offer that kind of transitionary pathway into, you know, come and have a go at the activity. We'll modify it to suit you. We'll build it up. There's not an expectation that you move into sort of a more traditional form of the sport from the get-go, and just how sort of willing and supportive clubs are to be able to do that. I think where I've seen sort of this transition be kind of well managed has been where clubs have been very proactive, making partnerships with special education units or with special education schools in the local area, where they've connected to disability groups where people come together for other purposes, and they've sort of said, you know, how about for 6 weeks of your sessions, you come to us at the club and just come and have a go at the activity. So where, again, it's such a lot of onus on the clubs and on volunteers, but where they've really done great outreach work to other places and spaces where people with disabilities are, and really tried to invite them and welcome them into the club environment. I think as well, we kind of miss, when we're looking at engaging people with disabilities, there's a spectrum of disabilities, but we miss the other intersections as well. So sort of gender's come out as a really strong issue in a lot of my research, in that young women with disabilities feel particularly marginalised often within a club environment. And, you know, if you think about traditional forms of voluntary sport, it's divided by gender all the time. And then when we get to people with disabilities, we sort of say, oh, well, you know, it doesn't matter, mix everyone in all together and it's all fine. You know, we kind of ignore that gender dynamic and the gender aspect. So the work I did with cricket, and I had a number of young women that were sort of playing cricket in a disability group, but they felt quite excluded and quite isolated because they were playing with young men essentially, and you know, all the same issues that you might have with mainstream participation. Of the young men they were playing with had more skills, more knowledge of the sport. They really wanted to do it, but they just didn't sort of have that support there. And the fact that because they were disabled, it was almost like it was gender blind, and no one was kind of considering those dynamics that were happening there at all. Different dynamics as well to consider in terms of how the club engages different types of people, and particularly people that haven't been active before. It's not just about considering the disability, it's all those other intersections that will impact on why people may or may not have been active in the past.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, mentioning about intersectionality, because the temptation is just to kind of view people from a kind of one perspective, when of course that just is too simplistic and ignores the reality and complexity.
Yeah, and it's really rare to find any sort of sporting association or policy, and certainly not at the club level necessarily, where they do think with that intersectional lens, particularly in the space of disability. It is just seen as like disability is the whole thing, and that's all we're dealing with. And okay, we've got a spectrum of people with disabilities, so there's difference there, but without fully taking into account all the sort of other dimensions that can impact that. It's almost like it's sort of an afterthought and a bit of a surprise of like, oh, okay, the young women aren't enjoying it and they're not feeling included, but they're not feeling included because of their disability. They're not feeling included because of the gender dynamics that are existing in that very masculine sporting space. You know, it just sort of gets lost, I think, when we're considering about these issues.
Yeah, again, fantastic point. I completely agree. So let's conclude. So what I'd like to do is kind of look to the future, but also provide a kind of solution-focused approach if possible. So if there are members of clubs or people involved in the running of clubs, and they are interested in providing opportunities for disabled people and haven't perhaps currently got that provision, what would you recommend that these clubs need to do? What is the best course of action if a club wants to provide sporting opportunities for disabled people?
I think there's sort of several kind of things to do here. Ideally, try and connect with those organisations that do have expertise in this space, and that might be, you know, starting with the governing body, starting with your local authority, and just seeing what expertise is there, and then definitely connecting with different disability organisations in the local community is a great way just to understand the space and to understand, well, who's actually in my local community that might want to come and play sport at my club. And then I think from their sort of engagement with people with disabilities, trying to sort of find out, well, what are their needs, what sort of provision would they like, is, you know, a great sort of step forward. Certainly with junior sections and young people, we've really found that parents are just a most wonderful resource for understanding how to work inclusively. Had some great examples of parents providing education for coaches on, you know, this is how to communicate effectively with my child. This is sort of how you might modify this to make sure that everyone's included in this activity. So I think there's often a lot of local resources that a club can tap into, and particularly if you start to get a few participants along, just really using that to sort of learn from those people and understand how to best kind of adapt provision. Certainly sort of working with your different sporting associations and your local authorities on what funding's available, what resources can we draw on to help us with this. And I think one of the most powerful sort of support for clubs getting into this space was we actually developed some communities of practice over here and networks amongst clubs. So pairing up clubs that are interested in developing provision with people with disabilities with those that have already done it, and just, you know, really powerful hearing other volunteers telling you about your journey. So I think that's a great way to really get going, is to talk to clubs that have done work in this space and just sort of see how they do it. And there's a lot to be said for having that advice from someone who's in exactly the same situation as you and is saying, yeah, as a volunteer group, this is what we did and this was what's successful. Think of a few different sort of strategies, but it's certainly reaching out and getting that information is the key first step.
Excellent. No, thank you ever so much for that. And it's been really great chatting to you, Ruth. I really enjoyed talking about it and learning from your knowledge, and fascinating discussions. So thank you ever so much for chatting and spending your time with me. I know in Australia, obviously it's in the evening for you, so I really do appreciate you taking the time. I look forward to catching up with you soon.
No, thank you, Chris. That was great. It was great to chat. Thank you.
Professor Ruth Jeans there, providing a thorough overview of voluntary sports clubs. We now turn our attention to disability sport coaching. To understand this area in more detail, I spoke with Keon Richardson. So welcome, Keon. Thank you for joining me today for a discussion about grassroots disability sport coaching. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Keon, to the show. So we've got Keon Richardson. He has great expertise about coaching blind football and kind of general coaching experience and education. And so for today's discussion, we're going to learn a little bit more about what disability sport coaching is. So I think, Keon, just to kind of start our discussion, can you explain what do we mean by disability sport coaching? And also, how does it differ from non-disabled sport coaching? So I wonder if you could kind of just start our conversations with answering those questions, please.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, first of all, thank you for having me, Christopher. Most appreciated. And yeah, disability sport in its entirety refers to a sport that's been modified from its original context, or it's been designed specifically for people with disabilities. So a sport like bocce is designed for people with disabilities, with physical disabilities. You got goalball, who's designed for people with visual impairments. And the term disability sport is used interchangeably with other terms like adaptive sport, Paralympic sport, para sport. So disability sport coaching, simply put, is coaching children or young people, adults who have a disability. So it could be a pan-disability session where you have people with a range of disabilities and you're perhaps coaching one sport, so pan-disability football. It could be, as I mentioned, it could be goalball, where you're coaching a sport that's designed specifically for people with visual impairments. Or it could be adaptive sport, which is adapted from a mainstream sport, so like blind football, for example, which is adapted from futsal.
Okay, and from your experience, what is kind of the most common approach to grassroots disability sport? Is it the PAN session where we have multiple impairment groups, or is it more kind of specific to a particular impairment category or a particular sport? I mean, from your own experience, how have kind of mainstream organizations tried to approach disability sport?
So it varies from different countries and different settings within that country. So I think in England, for example, I think initially we went down the route of pan-disability, whereas I think because certain impairment groups want to play specific sports, I think it's more geared towards impairment-specific sports. So I think a lot of organizations are looking to introduce impairment-specific sports as opposed to pan-disability. I think pan-disability you often see more for people who have learning disabilities, because there's not really much adaptations that are needed for people who have learning disabilities. But if you're looking at impairment groups like people with cerebral palsy or people who have vision impairment, they're often looking to get into sports that have been adapted or modified specifically for their impairment.
Okay, so from a mainstream perspective, I mean, to me, I'm saying not a coach myself, but it seems like it's probably easier to organize a pan disability session. You don't have to have specific equipment, or you don't have to have specific coaching expertise to focus on a particular impairment group. So would that be fair to say that perhaps in the past, pan disability sessions have been focused on because there isn't huge amounts of adaptations that were required? Is that a fair comment to make?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, again, the participants you often have in pan disability sessions, they often don't have a range of needs in compared to, let's say, a group of people with vision impaired who need audible equipment. The communication is going to be a lot different. It's going to be a lot of verbal cues than visual cues. So yeah, I think again there's a lot less adaptation that are needed for pan disability.
Okay, and in terms of the specific impairment group kind of approach to coaching, that sounds quite tricky to try and organize and deliver, because you've got to kind of cater to the specific needs. You've got to understand what is required to be effective coaches. So what is the best approach trying to do those sessions? Because for the coaches who are listening, how would they go about delivering specific sessions for a particular impairment group?
Yeah, so I think it's understanding the group of individuals you have. And I know that sounds cliche to say, but I think when we're looking at specific impairment groups, what you'll often have is you'll have a wide range of experience. And one of the reasons why is because you often have players or participants who have acquired impairment. So they acquired their disability later on in life, whereas you have someone who's born with their impairment. So again, if we're looking at someone who has who's born, you would look at people who are vision impaired. If you had someone who was born totally blind, their understanding of sport or particular jargon that you use in sport could be completely different to someone who's played football at a particular level and then eventually lost their sight, maybe perhaps when they were 18. So it's understanding how the communication would vary between the two individuals I just mentioned, and again understanding what their sporting needs are. So the person who's born blind, they may not have the same experiences as the person who's played football at a high level in terms of exposure to different physical movements, and sort of their disposition towards sport. Because as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of people with disabilities are often discriminated from participating in sport, whether it's just been told that there's no opportunity for you, or access to the appropriate equipment, or the distance from where they live to where the session is. So these factors will all have an influence on their attitudes towards sport and how their self-confidence. So it's understanding. I think a lot of it's understanding the person as an individual, their own experiences of sport, understanding their self-confidence, and how what their sporting needs are in terms of what does one player needs to develop more of a peer relationships with other people who have a disability or don't have a disability, depending on what type of session it is, or do they need to improve their mobility, or do they need to improve their physical literacy skills, and that comes through, again, just having chats, having talks with the player or the participant, or as well, again, looking observations as well. So observing during your coaching practice, seeing how they adjust to the type of space they're playing in, and their technical ability is just making sure you're observant of particular things.
Okay, and in terms of how a coaching session is organised or how it is designed and developed, to what extent do coaches, from your experience, consider the lived experience of disability for that particular individual? So do coaches come in to sessions for disabled people and think, yeah, this is how I'm going to teach it, and they have to adapt to me? Or is it more, okay, this is what I think should be going on for this particular session, and then they adapt to the participants themselves? I mean, what, from your experience, how does it usually work?
Yeah, I think it's normally the latter. So I think for me, a lot of coaches involved in disability sport are often the polar opposite to grassroots sport. So typically in mainstream sport, the coach is kind of the boss. They're whatever they say or do, the final word, and you adjust to what they want or what they're going to do. Whereas I think disability sport, again, because you kind of have an understanding of the background that people with disabilities are coming from. It might be their first time participating in sport. Their parents are bringing them to kind of have respite, or to get them to create new friends. So I think a lot of it is being adjusting around their needs and what their motivation for coming to your session is.
In terms of the provision of coaching for disabled people, what's kind of the most popular, or what's the most common in terms of who it's targeted at? Is it going to be for younger people? Is it for adults? What about older adults? What kind of provision exists for those people from the different age ranges?
Yes, I think there's a lot of provision for young people. There's a lot of different funding pots that allow organisations to apply for funding, be it your county football associations, or local charities, or Sport England. Organisations are wanting to focus on developing sport opportunities for people with disabilities. So there's a lot of what they can see that's been done in schools or community settings, and then I think a lot of charity or adult sessions or adult clubs if they want to go down the competitive route in terms of competing in leagues. So yeah, I think for adults, I don't think there's as much in compared to children, but I think there definitely is quite a fair balance for children and adults.
Okay, and in terms of for a non-disabled coach, what's the education like for coaches when they are developing their craft and developing their experience and skills? When you were becoming, a more of a higher ranked coach or getting more experience, how did you find the education for including people from kind of different backgrounds, such as disability?
Yes, I think a lot of it is experiential learning, so learning through experience.
Mm.
When I think about, I'm 27 and I started my coaching journey when I was around 14, 15. And when I think about the different culture education courses I've done, my background's mainly in football and futsal, but I don't really think the FA used to have a coaching course for coaching disabled footballers, coaching blind footballers, coaching deaf footballers. But it was only a course for a day, and like there's only so much you can get out of a day's coaching course. So essentially, it was learning from when I've been to different coaching in different settings. So I've coached Party Side and their futsal regional talent centre. I've done learning disability football sessions. I've done pan disability football sessions. I've done mental health football sessions. And a lot of it you learn through experience, as I said. So you learn through other coaches that are perhaps leading the session. You learn from the different participants you have in front of you and how you adapt according to their needs, be it their impairment or their motivational needs to participate in the session. So, yeah, and then I think the academic side kind of helped a lot in terms of understanding theoretical approaches and pedagogical approaches to coaching. So one of the very useful theories that I've come across was the STEP model developed by Black and Stevenson. So the STEP is basically activity framework based on the inclusion spectrum framework. So it is looking at maximizing participation for people of all abilities, ages, and different genders. So STEP is an acronym. So the S stands for space. So it's increasing or decreasing the space according to the mobility of your participation of your participants. So looking at the interaction and movement within that area, and then you can have things like a safe zone or ability based zone. So if you're doing a tag game, for example, if you know you have someone who has cerebral palsy, so they may have limited movement, you may create a safe zone within that box to say, right, if you need a breathe or time out, you'll find it difficult, you can stay in that safe zone for 5 seconds, 3 seconds. So it's sort of modifying the space according to the player's need and what type of interaction you want to have. And then the task is obviously looking at what objective you're trying to achieve from the session and how you adjust the task to fit with your objectives. So if I'm looking shooting with both feet, I may say the task is if you're right-footed and you score with your left foot, the goal's worth 3 points. And then if you're looking at equipment, so the E in STEP stand for equipment. So looking at adjusting the equipment to bring out different returns. So if we're looking at dribbling, for example, and having close control, you may want to use smaller balls. Or again, if you have someone who has a visual impairment and struggles to see the ball, you can use an audible ball or a brighter coloured ball. And again, thinking about equipment, looking at cones as well. So in previous sessions, when I've done pan disability sessions, I remember I had a session where I predominantly had adults who had learning disabilities. So I'd normally use like cones, like saucer cones. I literally remember he doesn't often come to the session, but there was a participant who had a wheelchair. There was a wheelchair user, and literally he would just crush all the saucer cones. So if I'm just thinking, again, if I'm just thinking from this is my session, I can just say you're the issue because your wheelchair's crushing my cones. Whereas actually you can use flat markers, and I like to use flat markers because again, you don't have the issue of people crushing on them or people have sensory needs or limit spatial awareness. Instead of stepping on your cones, you can use a flat marker, so it prevents that issue from happening. And then the P is for people. So it's looking at how people interact within that session. So looking at small-sided games. So again, if I've got a group of people who have cerebral palsy, instead of the game being 11 aside, so having 22 people on the field, I may do the game of cerebral palsy actually is 7 aside, but I could actually say, I can make it 3-against-3, so that there's more movement. There's not many affordances for the kids, the people self-employed to make so many complex decisions. You can break it down to 3v3 to focus on a particular task. So it could be shooting, could be defending, and I kind of added another letter. So I call it steps instead of step. So the last one is the score, which I mentioned. So manipulating the score. So if you're looking at football, typically through football, you score. The point is scored by shooting the ball in the goal. So again, looking at the score, depending on what my task is or the objective for the session, how can I adjust the score to help motivate the participants? So, like I mentioned as an example, if I'm looking at shooting with both feet, I could say if you shoot with your less preferred foot, it could be 3 points. Or if I'm looking at counter-attacking, I could say if you tackle the ball from an opponent and score within 10 seconds, the goal's worth 5 points. So it's again looking at manipulating the score in alignment with what the objective of my session is.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you for that. I mean, so that's a step model, or for you, Keon, the adapted version is steps. So that's I'm not sure if it's a trademark or copyright, but that's what Keon uses, is the steps model. They're really interesting. So thank you for that. And on the description for the podcast episode, I'll include a link to the step model so that people can have a look at it if they are interested. Okay, so you obviously have a passion and interest in disability sport, clearly based on your experience and your background. For those coaches who maybe don't have any involvement or any particular interest in disability sport, what should they do, or what should they consider if for their mainstream session there is an individual with an impairment who wants to participate? How would that coach go about adapting, or what should they be aware of when delivering the session for people with impairments who are also wanting to participate in their coaching session? What should a non-disabled coach who hasn't particularly had much involvement or experience with disability go about delivering that session?
Yes, I think essentially, I think with disability, I think it's kind of been a taboo thing. So I think for many, especially in the realms of coaching, for people who don't have experience coaching disability sport or people with a disability, they're often scared to touch around the subject. So I think it's just having a conversation with their parent or the player about, okay, what do you have? First of all, do you have any medical needs I need to be aware about in relation to your disability or your impairment? What are you comfortable doing? What aren't you comfortable doing? And what is the best way to effectively communicate with you? So when I was working at Barking Sight and Deaf Futsal Regional Talent Centre, I helped a few of the players after their post-exit from the programme get into mainstream futsal clubs. So again, a lot of the coaches didn't have experience communicating with a player who has a hearing impairment. But I think it's just understanding like how some of the verbal cues, or even just understanding bits of sign language from themselves. So again, a person who has a hearing impairment, if you're going to communicate, don't put your hand over your mouth or don't have your back turned towards them when you're communicating. So I think it's like I said, but that comes from, for one, it comes from experience, but two, more importantly, it comes from having a communication with that person. Because again, some people use a hearing aid, so they can pick up on sometimes even if your back is turned, they can pick up on what you are saying, whereas some people don't, or they rather lip read. So again, it's understanding the individual, and yeah, again, that will help inform your practice, because you can just assume, this person is therefore they have cerebral palsy, therefore they can't do this, they can't do that. But it's like I said, all these factors which are beneath the surface about if they were born with impairment or if they acquired it on later life is going to affect their sporting needs and their understanding of sport and how they communicate and how they live their experiences. So I think as you mentioned, as you asked at the start, is understanding their lived experiences, and then we can set up a plan. I can't give a prescription of what you should do, because I think it's essentially understanding the person first. So again, you may have a person in your session who's got a visual impairment. They may be partially sighted, so they may have tunnel vision. So again, it's thinking about how you set up your practice, what type of do you use pitch markings. So again, if it's a session where you have everyone who's sighted, you may be able to get away with not using cones, because you may say, "Oh, we're playing up to the white lines," whereas some people may have color blindness or a vision impairment that makes it difficult for them to see certain colors or certain pitch markings. So again, it's understanding the individual as well.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, it sounds like to me, as a non-expert, obviously you are the expert in terms of coaching, that you just adjust it around your participants like you would in any other situation. Yeah, so excellent coaching should be, what's your participants like? What do they need? You know, how should you structure it based on their requirements, etc., rather than having that predefined idea of what exactly you're going to deliver. It's about being flexible, adaptable, etc.
Yeah.
I think also what you said about some people kind of skirting around the issue of disability because maybe they don't want to offend someone, or they're a bit not sure about what they're allowed to say, etc. I think that kind of taps into there was a campaign by Scope, the charity, a few years ago called End the Awkward. I don't know if you saw it. Had Warwick Davis in it, for example, where some people don't engage disability because they are worried about offending, when actually we just got to treat them like individuals. They are people at the end of the day. And so how do people get over that? If they are just afraid they might offend someone or they might not do it right, as you say, most of what your experience or your ability as a coach is based on your experiences. But how do people actually have confidence enough to be able to engage and learn that experience in the first place? What would your key recommendation be for coaches who maybe are a little bit afraid about getting involved in this space?
Yeah, I think what's important is to try and find a mutual ground. I've worked in disability sport in different contexts in different countries. Since 2018, I've been working on introducing blind football in Zimbabwe, or formalize it for a project. And what I found was that many people were quite although they want to participate in football, they've been told for a large part of their life that they can't because they're blind or they're vision impaired. So although they're interested in sport, it's not something you can kind of form the relationship on as the first point. So it's kind of finding like a mutual ground in something. So for me, I was always interested in the Shona language, which is one of the native languages in Zimbabwe. So again, I think what we have to realize as well as able-bodied coaches, that there kind of is a power dynamic between, again, you see it in the coach-athlete relationship, but being a non-disabled coach versus with a disabled athlete, there is a sort of power dynamic that exists. So it's kind of just breaking that and just saying, look, like, and for me, my personal principle is that, although yes, we do have hierarchy, we do need to have respect. Like, it is a collaboration, because without any coaching is worthless. You don't have any players, and players need coaches to be able to improve and enhance their performance. So it's understanding there's a mutual relationship, and it doesn't always have to be our relationship solely based on football. They could be really interested in a certain genre of music, or you could be interested in art. And again, that just comes from just having a conversation with that person and just not being afraid. Because even, again, like I said, it's understand the individual. Because some people are happy. Some people with disabilities are happy to, like we have jargon, like, if I'm working with a blind person, for example, and I say, "Do you see what I mean?" Or did you see that? It's like, well, of course I didn't see it. for some people, they may generally take offense to it, whereas others are again, some people may be born without being blind, so they understand that jargon. When you're around people with disabilities more often, like, you just become more comfortable about not being offensive, because you understand the person's you understand their personality, you understand like how far you can go with certain jokes and stuff like that. So I think it's just immersing yourself within settings where people with disabilities, and it becomes less of a thing of, I don't want to offend you. Then it becomes less about offending than more about developing a personal relationship. I think the challenge with disability sport coaching is that, again, because in comparison to grassroots sport, the number of people with disability who participate in sport compared to people without disability sport is quite sporadic. It's a lot lower for people with disability. So I think the demand, although the demand is there, it's not as significant as grassroots sport. So there's not many. Like if I look at my FA level 1, for example, in coaching football, if I'm not mistaken, it was over 10 days. Whereas a lot of disability sport coaching courses are like introductory courses. It's for like a day. It's a day-long workshop. I know Global have a introductory global coaching course, which was for 1 day. And again, it was although it was for 1 day, it was quite impactful. But I think it would be more helpful if there was a longer course, and if it had like more similar to like what the FA do. We have in situ visits where tutors come out and see you in practice and give you advice and recommendations. I think that's kind of happening in different sports. I know with the Football Association, they have coach mentors for disability football, which is something I feel that's quite important. But it'd be nice to see that across a range of different sports as well.
What are the main challenges then facing coaches in disability sport? I mean, you probably mentioned quite a few already, but are there any additional challenges or real kind of prominent challenges that you want to highlight that coaches might face when they are trying to include people from a wide background such as disability?
Yeah, so I think a few of the challenges are mainly around locality in terms of where your session is in relation to where people with disabilities live. And again, transportation might be issues if they got a mobility, if they have a mobility impairment or a physical impairment. It may be a cost for parents to send them to your session, so they may not attend as regularly. And again, looking at the cost of venue hire in relation and in correlation with access to funding, sometimes it might not be possible to have a regular weekly session. It might be a session that runs for 2 months or once a month. But again, sometimes it's hard to see, although you're having an impact, it's hard to see. You'll see a lot more fluctuation in development because, again, if you're doing a session for once a month, for that one session, you might see they're improving quite a lot, whereas the next month you might see a bit of regression because it's been so long since they last participated in your formal session. But I think to counteract that, I think for me, it comes back to your practice design. So for me, I always like to deliver activities and games that, if they had the right equipment, they could do that by themselves or with their friends or with their parents or family members in their own, away from the session. And I think another issue is around equipment. So again, if you're looking at specific impairment groups, especially for people with vision impairments, you're going to need adapted equipment. Also, even for like people who are wheelchair users, we're looking at power chair football. We also need a specific type of chair to play the sport, and then you also need the ball's a lot bigger compared to like a regular 11-side football. And again, it's not cheap, so a lot of adaptive equipment is quite expensive. So even from blind football, for example, like an average ball costs around £30. So again, if you've got a session of 10 kids, you want to buy 10 balls, 5 balls, that's more than £150. So it can be quite expensive to get access to adaptive equipment, especially if you haven't got funding to do so. And I think another challenge is, again, if you're one of the coaches who kind of does the prescription coaching, it's kind of difficult to get that engagement because, again, you don't really have a real understanding of what the participants want from the session, what their experiences and needs, what experiences they have and what their needs are. So you may not get that active engagement that you'd like to see.
Okay, some really interesting challenges that you've highlighted there. Final question, I think. Let's end it on positive. What does excellent coaching look like for disability sport, in your opinion?
Yeah, so for me, excellent grassroots coaching, this really looks like participants who are fully engaged. They're getting a large number of benefits from the session, not just, so you can look at the technical aspect and physical aspect, but I think also the psychological aspect and social aspect for me is quite important. So they're developing almost like a family-like network with the participants. They feel they're not only friends, but they feel like they're lifelong friends that they developed. And from the psychological aspect, their self-esteem is improving, their confidence and their desire to participate in sport. I think that's one of the key things. I think is what looks like excellent coaching. So seeing someone who may not like sport or who has big hesitations about participating in sport, to saying to their mom that they can't wait for the next session, or they're frustrated that they turned up 5 minutes late. I think that's what excellent grassroots coaching looks like to me. That means that you're delivering a high quality experience that they want to be part of and they don't want to miss out on.
Thank you so much, Keon. It's been great chatting to you, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Chris. Really, really enjoyed it, and thank you for having me.
No worries. Thank you. We now turn to a series of discussions on sport participation experiences focused by impairment groups. First up is Dr. Jess Macbeth discussing the sport participation experiences of individuals with a visual impairment. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining. It's great to have you on. Would you be able to describe the research that's been carried out into grassroots sport participation for those individuals with visual impairments, please?
Yeah, no problem at all, Chris. Thanks for having me on. In terms of research specifically into grassroots, there's not a huge amount. But when it comes to VI sport, it's quite a new body of literature, I would say. So probably most of it has emerged in the last 10 to 15 years. And to be honest, I think maybe it's more the elite participants that have attracted most attention from researchers. But just to give you a little bit of an overview, there's been some previous studies on the socialisation experiences of people with visual impairments going into sport. There was a few studies in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, but they were largely quantitative studies that were just looking at some key kind of influences on individuals with visual impairments. More recently, there's been some qualitative studies that started to explore the sporting biographies of usually visually impaired athletes that are maybe at what we would class as more of an elite level, but that's kind of tracked their participation through the kind of grassroots pathways and into that elite setup that they might be in. So, for example, research that I've done around partially sighted footballers who've played for England has looked at their kind of socialisation experiences and experiences in grassroots level. There's been some work around the socialisation experiences of goalball players in the US, for example. Again, Justin Hagel's been involved in that with colleagues. And a lot of that research has looked at the varied experiences, or at least revealed very varied experiences of visually impaired people, depending on several things, particularly the nature of their visual impairment, their educational experiences. So whether or not they've been educated in mainstream schools or integrated settings, as they might say in the US, or within special education needs schools. There's also been a fair bit of research that started to look around things like meaning and identity. For example, Ben Powis's research on visually impaired cricket delved into that in a lot of detail. Hammer's study around tandem mountain biking. And there's been some research also on goalball athletes as well in the US by Jenks and Jenks. So a lot of this research on meaning and identity has started to look at the extent to which participating in sport at both grassroots and elite levels is empowering for people with visual impairments, or equally ways in which it might be disempowering as well, and the impact that it might have on their identity. There's also been a few studies that have focused on barriers and facilitators and equity issues, media representations, sensory experiences. And I would say probably the largest body of literature or theme around visually impaired sport is around classification. Now, that's mainly focusing on part of the the IPC and IBSA's, the International Blind Sports Association, projects around reviewing classification systems at the moment. And whilst that's focusing mainly on Paralympic sports, it does have some repercussions potentially down at grassroots levels, or certainly in terms of kind of player pathways for athletes in those sports as well. So that's a bit of a summary of the research that's been done around visually impaired sport. But I suppose what we're most interested in is some of those kind of issues or barriers and facilitators that impact VI people getting involved in sport and staying involved in sport.
Yeah, really interesting overview, and thank you for doing that. First of all, why do you think there hasn't been huge amounts of research in this particular area? Is this just generally in disability research there isn't a huge amount, or is it specifically within disability research there's not a huge amount for VI? What's your views there?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that research around disability sport has gathered pace over the last decade or so. Definitely, it's become a much more popular area of academic research. And that's clearly been impacted by the prominence of the Paralympic Games now. But the danger of that, I think, is that it does neglect potentially a focus on Paralympic sport, does neglect a huge kind of range of sports that people with disabilities are involved in. So, for example, if we look at visually impaired sport, the VI sport that is part of the Paralympic programme is only a small window really into VI sport, and there's a lot that goes on outside of the Paralympic Games that a lot of people don't know about. Even visually impaired people aren't that aware of the opportunities that exist. So in answer to your question around why there's a limited amount of research on VI sport, I think it's because there's a relatively limited amount of opportunities specific to VI people to participate in sport. It is growing, but those organisations that are responsible for that are not necessarily particularly well resourced. So the likes of British Blind Sport are quite a small team, not particularly well resourced, do a great amount of work, partner up with the likes of Thomas Pocklington Trust and RNIB and Sport England and Activity Alliance. But there's only so much that they can do within their means. So when there's not a huge amount necessarily going on, then there's less chance that that's going to become something that academic researchers are necessarily aware of and therefore interested in. The other thing is, largely academic researchers tend to be not disabled themselves that are interested in disability sport. There's not a huge amount of disabled people or visually impaired people who are necessarily researching within the sociology of sport or those types of areas. So naturally, those topic areas might not necessarily be highest on non-disabled researchers' priorities.
Yeah, okay. And what does the research say about whether sport, grassroots sport specifically, is a source of empowerment or disempowerment for VI individuals?
If we take, for example, Ben Paris's work around VI cricket, he did focus primarily on athletes that were involved in the England cricket squad. I think there's something to clarify here. When we're talking about a distinction between grassroots and elite level in VI sport, sometimes it's quite difficult to differentiate between grassroots level and elite level because there's not a huge kind of progression pathway there necessarily. But in terms of some of the work around that Ben's done, for example, on VI cricket, he talked about how playing cricket for some visually impaired players was the first time that they'd actually been part of a VI community, and sport was what brought them together. So that's just one example of the way in which sport could play a really empowering role for individuals. But there's also issues within grassroots and elite level sport for people with visual impairments that could result in some kind of disempowering or inequitable situations for participants as well. So it's a real challenge for those who are the key stakeholders. And I think this is another issue that's really important is with all disability sport, and we see it within VI sport specifically, it's quite messy in terms of the organisation and the structure. The coordination of opportunities across that range of stakeholders, I wouldn't necessarily say is there yet and is clear. Just to give an example, I was at VI Football Forum last week that was organised by British Blind Sport off the back of a VI Sports Forum. That was looking at the Northwest and what football opportunities there were in the Northwest. And the first step with those stakeholders is to do a mapping exercise to find out more amongst those that are providing the activities, to find out more about what each other are doing because you've got county FAs, you've got VI sports clubs that are multi-sport clubs, all doing things, but not necessarily knowing what each other are doing and not necessarily coordinating that as well as maybe it could be. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of the way that things are structured and organised. But if those groups can work well in partnership with each other, then ideally, the opportunities and the provision should be quite strong. And the other challenge for visually impaired people is also advertising opportunities appropriately. So those organisations that are experts in VI know how to advertise things in an accessible way, through their partnerships reach the VI community. But maybe more mainstream organisations don't necessarily have that expertise and need to partner up with those organisations that do, to make sure that information about any sessions reaches the right people in the right way.
And just for our listeners, what is the right way of communicating opportunities?
Well, I think there needs to be more research that also asks that question, that works with visually impaired people about, what types of channels of information would you access. There's ways of going through eye clinics, for example. There's the health side of things and avenues that way. There's the mainstream sports organisations. There's lots of different ways in which this kind of information could reach visually impaired people. So I think it's a case of consulting with them to understand what is the best way of advertising those opportunities. But I think the likes of British Blind Sport, RNIB, Thomas Pocklington Trust, the sight loss councils that are regionalised around the country are really important kind of experts in terms of developing accessible materials and getting that disseminated through channels that visually impaired people are most likely to access.
Okay, and I think touched upon this already, but just to kind of really get clarity, what would the literature say? What does the literature say in terms of how to facilitate sport participation opportunities for VI individuals?
I think when it comes to visually impaired people, there's some similar barriers and enablers as there are to other groups of disabled people. There's some generic ones. When it comes to visually impaired people, I think there's some distinct challenges that comes with being visually impaired that facilitators need to be aware of to try to reduce those barriers. And one of the key ones is a lack of local provision. And when you've got a spread geographically of sport and physical activity opportunities for people with visual impairment, which requires them to travel, that is one of the most significant barriers, because visual impaired people, depending on their visual impairment, but if you are registered partially sighted, you're not able to drive. So you're either dependent on someone else or a club to have transport, is rare, to be honest, or you're relying on public transport. Some of the best ways to facilitate visually impaired people getting involved in particular sessions, Goalball UK, when they put on their club opportunities, they try to have a meet and greet at a train station, for example, at a particular time to support visually impaired people to get from that train station to whatever the venue needs to be. So the proximity to good public transport links and regular public transport links, but then also that extra touch, that extra support in terms of meeting and greeting is particularly important. So if you're wanting to attract people with visual impairment who don't have that luxury of being able to drive themselves to a particular venue, then you need to think about those additional things especially. I think they get exacerbated by the fact that because numbers are low, a lot of opportunities need to be organised, maybe spread around the country. British Blind Sport Taster Days, they try to cover the country in terms of strategically having something in each region, but that can still mean quite a considerable amount of travelling for people to access those sessions. Going back to the research I've done around partially sighted football, lack of awareness and a lack of local opportunities, and therefore the need to travel, were the key challenges, definitely, and potentially the key issues that will prevent more people from getting involved.
Okay, and if we're thinking about one particular thing that needs to be done to increase participation for people with visual impairments, what would that be?
I think in an ideal world, it would be more local opportunities on the doorstep that are easily accessible for people with visual impairment. Now, in reality, there's probably not enough numbers to justify very local opportunities. But then that comes back to the question is, would that possibly be the case if awareness was raised and if the advertising of these particular opportunities was reaching visually impaired people in the right way. So I know you asked for one thing there, but I think it is a complex combination of those things that need to all fall into place really for things to improve. I think there needs to be more research around, is the demand there as well? But it would be great to get that better understanding of visually impaired people in terms of what their preferences would be in relation to sport and physical activity, and then tailor opportunities around that demand or those preferences that are not necessarily met yet.
One final question. When it comes to mainstream organisations, does the nature of the impairment and awareness of opportunities have an influence on the sport participation of visually impaired individuals?
I think in terms of mainstream organisations, there needs to be more expertise around specific impairment groups within mainstream organisations. Or if it's not expertise within those organisations, then really kind of joined up thinking and partnerships with those organisations that can provide that expertise. So when it comes to the likes of putting on sports opportunities for mainstream organisations, putting on sporting opportunities for visually impaired people, for example, there's not a huge amount of education around how to do that. British Blind Sport and UK Coaching have put together the Coaching People with a Visual Impairment course that people can do. That's an online course. Other than that, most stuff is around coaching disabled people, and it's broader, it's much more generic. And I don't think in any kind of impairment group we necessarily have a huge amount of education for people delivering on the ground how to tailor things towards specific impairment groups. A lot of it is still quite generic. I think a lot of work could be done in those areas around specific impairment groups. But that work needs to be done with people from those specific impairment groups informing that in the process from the very start. So I do think there's some useful awareness raising resources out there. So for example, again, there's a document around VI friendly athletics, VI football, the generic Coaching People with Visual Impairment course that can be done. Recently, Thomas Pocklington Trust and UK Coaching have developed a toolkit called Inclusive Facilities Supporting People with Visual Impairment. And that's aimed at leisure facilities, at gyms, at sports facilities. And that's specific to visual impairment, which is great. So we're starting to see an increase in guidance that's aimed at supporting specific impairment groups. But I think until that's happened, we've only really had very generic supporting disabled people resources and guidance, and therefore it's been very superficial. So I think that's fundamental. If mainstream organisations and leisure facilities, for example, are to support visually impaired people and support them effectively and to be welcoming to them, I think some of those kind of educational resources are really, really important. And it's good to see them starting to develop. I think they're really important, but it'd be great to have more of those that are also sport specific as well.
Okay, I think that's really good clarity. And I've talked about this with another interviewee that disability is quite a catch-all term, isn't it? I mean, it belies the individuality and complexity of disability. You know, an individual with one particular impairment, their lived experience is going to be different from someone with a different type of impairment. So if we only have generic resources about disability generally, well, we can only kind of have guidance. We don't really have the specific insight.
When we talk about visual impairment itself, that in itself is a considerably broad label as well.
Exactly, yeah.
And within that, you've got people from partial sight who might only just fit into that category in terms of the nature of their visual impairment, through to completely blind. And the differences in terms of the challenges that they may have for sport and exercise generally could be quite diverse. And then when you start to look at some of the research that Ben and I have looked at in terms of football and cricket, demonstrated that one person could face particular barriers within the sport of cricket that are not as severe within a different sport, such as football. So whether or not they've got central vision or peripheral vision, and the outdoor conditions, how that can impact things, all of these factors make it quite dangerous to just label people, use the label of visual impairment without understanding more about individual, unique lived experiences of visual impairment that specific athletes might have or specific individuals might have that shape how they can or how they might not be able to access particular sports or sport in general.
Okay, I think that's a good way to end, actually. I think we've touched upon the complexity, unless there's anything else you'd like to add before we close.
In terms of running, the activity of running, if we're going back to thinking about some examples of enablers, the likes of Park Run, along with Sport England, have had a visually impaired running scheme in recent years. So they're trying to make park runs more attractive and working hard to try and attract more visually impaired people. And that all kind of links in with the fact that there's a Find a Guide database that can help visually impaired people who do need a guide runner to try and access those kind of opportunities. But through our research, we found that, depending on where visually impaired people might be located, there can be a lot of difficulty in getting guides, not just getting a guide, but one that's able to meet you at times that are convenient for the two of you, ones that are willing to run and match in terms of your speed, but also having more than one guide. So you're not always reliant on one person necessarily. But there's also been some developments within running around. For example, last September was the first Bristol VI 10K run took place. That's the first ever VI specific run that's been part of branched off an existing running event. Visually impaired people would ordinarily take part in the standard kind of running events that would take place. And have been doing that for many years and have enjoyed doing that as well. But that's the first time that there's been a VI specific race that's taken place. So whether we'll see more of that in the future or not will be interesting to see. But certainly the dependence on somebody else to guide can complicate further the kind of, being able to take part in particular events as well.
We now turn our focus to the sport participation and physical activity experiences of people with physical impairments. Dr. Tony Williams is our guide here. Thank you, Tony, for joining me today. Really appreciate you spending your time and sharing your expertise on individuals with physical impairments and their physical activity and sport participation experiences. So I think to begin and to help our listeners, are you able to please describe the research that has been carried out into the sport participation of individuals with physical impairments?
Sure. And thank you very much, Chris, for having me. Well, there's actually been a lot of research into the sport and physical activity participation of individuals with physical impairments. Much of that research has really focused upon the barriers and facilitators to sport and physical activity. So we see at the individual level, there are lots of factors about the individual that may prevent them or facilitate them from participating in sport. So, for example, that might include people not wanting to participate because they don't have the motivation to do so, or they have a fear or embarrassment of taking part. It might be that taking part in sport physical activity causes pain. So that might be another barrier that stops people. But also in terms of actual sport participation, some people actually just don't like sport. And so they would rather participate in other physical activities, more like exercise or general wheeling, rather than sport participation itself. And if you think as well about actual sports participation in terms of a team sport, or for example, someone with a physical impairment who's in a wheelchair, to actually participate in sport costs a lot of money, because you're talking about having a specialist sports wheelchair and other special equipment that doesn't come cheap. And so that doesn't involve playing sport in your everyday wheelchair. You need that specialist equipment. And that's something that often people cannot afford. And then if we look at the individual as well, someone might be really motivated to take part in sport or physical activity, but that doesn't mean that they're able to, because there's lots of other barriers that constrict participation. So at a social level, if you think about social support, depending on the level of physical impairment, might mean that someone's reliant or dependent upon others to participate. So that could be friends or family, ferrying people to or from sports and physical activity opportunities, providing emotional support, providing financial support. And then you see the role here of like healthcare professionals and other sport and exercise practitioners is quite important. So if you go to a healthcare professional who's knowledgeable about local sports opportunities or knows about accessible gyms, etc., then that's really great. But it can be that the healthcare professionals or sport and exercise practitioners don't know about opportunities for disabled people. Or it might be that once you go to a gym or a sports club that's supposedly accessible and inclusive, that you're faced with negative attitudes from others. that can be quite hurtful and exclusionary. So at a social level, we have quite a lot of barriers and facilitators as well. And then we also have the environment, the physical environment and the built environment in which sports and physical activities take place. So within institutions, is there disability-specific knowledge? Are the buildings accessible? Do they have the equipment? Do you have the coaches who understand how to include disabled individuals? Do you have the healthcare professionals or exercise practitioners who know how to adapt exercises for people who are disabled? And then you have kind of, again, at that environmental level, relationships between communities. So do schools and gyms and sports clubs talk to each other so that they can promote these opportunities? And as well, we see at an environmental level, the weather. So the bad weather can often stop people. So if it's snowy outside, so people are scared about slipping or tripping, or it's really wet or it's cold, that can stop people participating. And I think we've seen a lot through COVID, how important it is to have online support as well. So people don't, if they can't get out or we're not able to get out, you can still access those opportunities. And then again, within this kind of barriers and facilitators research, we have information about policy. So policies that may provide opportunities or hinder opportunities. So for example, with our construction policy, we now see that all new buildings must be accessible, they must have ramped access, etc. Whereas if you go to an opportunity that's in a dated building, those barriers to physically actually entering a facility or having the space in a changing room to transfer from chair to chair, or having the space to be able to maneuver around a changing room would be restricted because of the building, the age and the size. So a lot of the research has really focused on those barriers and facilitators.
Okay, and it's a very complex picture from what you've painted to me there. And when we're looking at the kind of the population more specifically, physical impairments is quite a broad category, includes a number of different types of impairments. What has traditionally been focused on in terms of that particular impairment within the broader physical impairment category? So is it potentially been more about wheelchair users? Has it been looking at cerebral palsy? What kind of physical impairments have been focused on in the research?
It's more common that the research focuses on one impairment than looks across. So that barriers and facilitators research I just mentioned was across. There is quite a lot of research within spinal cord injury, which is where my focus has typically been. So those people who have acquired an impairment. And obviously when you think about having a significant illness or injury, which means an impairment has been acquired and then someone becomes disabled, that's huge in terms of coming to grips with understanding that. And that can make some of the barriers and facilitators, more specific to those populations. So if we think about people with spinal cord injury, first of all, if you've had a catastrophic injury which has changed your physical and motor sensory capabilities, that's a lot to deal with in and of itself. And then you're asking people now to become more physically active can be quite a challenge, just in thinking about, life has gone through a major change. And not only have I got to think about, the impact on relationships, on employment status, on being able to get around my house. For some people, actually then having to think about, now I have to be physically active for my health. It's another challenge that people have to deal with. And so we see within the spinal cord injury literature, in terms of sport participation, a lot of the rehabilitation in the spinal units was typically aimed towards sport. And that's where we see the birth of the Paralympics. And for some younger people, sports participation can be great. It can be a way of building confidence, gaining new skills, being part of that team. I know some people really love being part of a team sport. But on the other hand, it can also be quite difficult. People who, for example, played basketball before they were injured don't necessarily want to go and play wheelchair basketball because it's not the same. And you see within the spinal cord injury population as well, we have a higher incidence of older adults becoming spinal cord injured because the immediate care, paramedic care and care in hospital has got so much better. People are surviving and they're living with spinal cord injury in a much older age. So you're talking about trying to get an older generation active. Sport might be something that they're not interested in. So you kind of have those additional considerations that you need to make depending on the population you're dealing with. And again, if we think about spinal cord injured people as a population, and we look at the guidelines for being physically active and what level of sport or exercise participation people need to get for health benefits, we see that the generic guidelines, the level of intensity is quite high. So depending on the level of spinal cord injury and the level of impairment, it can be really difficult to hit the requirement for the number of minutes and the intensity at which people need to be active. So you do get this then development of, we have some guidelines specifically for spinal cord injured people, which show that at a lesser intensity of exercise, you can still reach those health benefits. And when we're thinking about promoting sport and physical activity, we need to move away from messages that are just focused solely on being active for health, and that kind of whole exercise as medicine narrative that individuals are responsible for their own health and well-being, and they must be active to do that. And we need to think about the other reasons that people want to be active, such as because it's fun, because it's pleasurable and it's enjoyable. And you can think about that enjoyment and pleasure in many different ways, such as like the whole kind of doing activities to get tired, to get sweaty, to really feel like you've exerted yourself, which when we come back to people with spinal cord injury, for example, that can be quite difficult to achieve, again, depending on that level of impairment. And yeah, being part of a team, taking part in a meaningful activity rather than just taking part in physical activity for health can be quite important if we want to motivate people to be active.
So lots of interesting content there, and I want to put out a few of those threads that you've talked about. So first of all, you mentioned about those guidelines, and you were saying how there's those generic guidelines that are provided, but also then specifically for spinal cord injuries. What level of involvement has been taken by individuals who actually form that population group in creating the guidelines? I'm just curious whether it's been designed from the grassroots up or it's been imposed from the top down.
That's a very good question. So, for example, with the spinal cord injury guidelines, that was an international effort of collaboration between researchers, between people with spinal cord injury themselves, physiotherapists, sport and exercise practitioners. Like, you had a lot of people coming together. And the actual guideline recommendation, which was what's the amount of exercise that needs to be undertaken to achieve a health benefit, that information was based upon the scientific literature, which shows this level of exercise has given X outcome. But when you look at how do we disseminate that information and what resources can be used to spread that knowledge, that research has been conducted with people with spinal cord injury themselves and the people who are promoting those messages, such as the healthcare professionals, because it's important that the messages around physical activity are meaningful and that they represent the experiences of the people who the message is trying to reach. So that's why it's really important that people with spinal cord injury were engaged in those messages and those resources in terms of getting that information out there.
So what's the kind of current approach to promoting physical activity and sport from organisations? Have they actually been doing that approach of focusing on more the kind of softer elements rather than just focusing on health?
Oh, that's a big question. If we're talking about organisations more broadly, the message is getting through that we need to focus beyond just health and look at the other benefits for sport. So the fact that it's about having fun, it's about engaging in activities that are meaningful, it's about bringing people together. And I don't know that I have examples off the top of my head where I can say an organisation has done X. You certainly see with the charities who have been involved in the broader physical activity and disability guidelines, such as Sport England and Disability Rights UK, those charities for sure are spreading the message around what else physical activity can do for us beyond our physical and mental health. And actually, you see a lot of campaigns at the moment focusing on mental health. We've certainly seen during the pandemic an increased rise in anxiety and depression, etc., through isolation. And we saw that our disabled community were particularly isolated during this time. And through the Sport England Active Life survey, sport and physical activity participation in particular decreased more than the non-disabled population. So the messages about being active now are for sure moving away from just the health benefits, but obviously the health benefits are still important. And we're looking now more at saying, yes, you can be active to increase your strength and to increase your muscle mass. And that makes activities such as transferring from a wheelchair easier. But it also means that you might have more energy to play with your children or to, when you come home from work at the end of the day. So those kind of messages are important too, about what are the benefits outside of just our health? What impact can this have on our lives in terms of employment, in terms of family, beyond just health?
Yeah, and again, I think that's a really good point. Kind of the transference of benefits that you can get from being physically active or participating in sport. Okay, so we understand probably potentially the most efficient or effective way of promoting physical activity in sport. How do we do that? And what has the research been like in terms of understanding the channels of communication that we use to actually reach our audience?
There's quite a bit of research which talks about what are the preferred channels in terms of who are the messengers and what are the messages. So we kind of talked about the messages of being for exercise beyond health, how else it can impact us. And then if you think about who is delivering those messages, we know that from the research, there's a few groups of people who are quite important for delivering the message. So you've got your healthcare professionals, our GPs, our physiotherapists, etc., who are seen as real credible messages of this type of information, of our physical activity information. But what we also know from the research is that this group of people don't always know how to promote sport and physical activity, and they don't know the specific information. So if I give you some examples, when we were doing our research with the physiotherapists in the spinal units, they absolutely knew the importance of being physically active, but that didn't always mean that they were actively promoting physical activity because, for example, they weren't aware of the guidelines of, how much activity should be undertaken for how long. They might not know about where in the local community that somebody lives there are activities. They might not know about the disability sport organisations and charities who can provide support. So, and their job involves so much more than just promoting physical activity, that again, it was seen as an addition to their role. And so it wasn't always something that came up in conversation. But you see, there are policies in place such as, make every contact count in the NHS, which is trying to get our healthcare professionals to be promoting healthier lifestyles, of which physical activity is one. But we also see the role of peers and our disability sports organisations, who often include disabled people themselves running those organisations, promoting the sports. And peers are a really credible source of information. So, those people who've been there, done that, who can tell stories. So we see in our research on narrative and the powerful capacity that stories have to shape our action, how important it can be for someone to tell a story about how they overcome the barriers that they face to be active and the benefits that they got from being physically active. So those stories from our peers are really important. And we've seen a lot with the new physical activity guidelines, the role of others such as social workers, the people who are interacting with disabled people on a more regular basis, and how they can be really credible messengers of physical activity information. So you've got kind of the people, and then you've got the ways that information can be disseminated. So, we've got our journal articles, but they're no good for our people who are outside of academia for getting information. So we see how that knowledge is translated into infographics, which nicely break down key information. But again, an infographic on its own doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change behaviour. So that might need to be supported with some workshops to help people know how to promote physical activity, with some videos. So we talked about the importance of stories. So actually circulating videos of people talking about their experiences. And that can be done online through social media, through websites, etc. So you've got lots of channels, lots of ways to get to people, get the message out to people, to disable people themselves, and then to get other people promoting physical activity.
So it's a big operation, it sounds like, to try and get that coordinated and working efficiently.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the research has also shown that you can't just tackle one barrier at a time, because people are not faced with just one barrier, they're faced with multiple barriers. And, we know that we live in a very ableist society that favours able-bodied individuals and discriminates against disabled people in terms of accessing opportunities to be physically active. And what we really need is kind of multi-sector approaches, or systems approaches, if you like, to promote physical activity. And that's quite a big undertaking, which is why we're probably still not getting the levels of activity that we would like. So in terms of addressing that, you kind of really need approaches to get more people physically active by engaging, trying to change environments and policy. You want to be fostering more inclusive and accessible environments and opportunities themselves. You need to be changing the knowledge and attitudes of healthcare professionals, sport and exercise practitioners, in terms of educating and motivating people. So you need really partnerships between our health and our community disabled organisations, where we're facilitating information, so sharing knowledge about local programmes and facilities, sharing equipment, being able to connect people together, so that if you're a healthcare professional, or you're a sport and exercise practitioner, or you're a GP, and you see interact with a disabled person, that you can have more positive and motivating conversations about sport and physical activity, and you're actually able to signpost people to accessible and inclusive opportunities. Because we see there are some really great initiatives that go on. So, for example, we had the Inclusive Fitness Initiative. And, so you had these gyms that basically had an Inclusive Fitness Initiative stamp. So this was a gym that was saying, I reach a certain standard of where disabled people could come and be physically active. But actually, it might be that the gym had a ramped access and the changing room was more spacious. But that didn't mean that there were positive attitudes of the non-disabled gym members in that space. You were still faced with the same pictures of non-disabled people sporting bodies, those motivational messages that are very ableist. So there does need to be this kind of systems approach to improving physical activity. And obviously we can try and address that one barrier at a time, but we need to be addressing those barriers together if we're going to be changing attitudes, improving access, and supporting disabled people to be physically active for life.
And you've hinted at this, and this is probably an impossible question to answer in the time that we have. So I've already kind of set you up to fail here, so apologies for that. What is the main thing that needs to be done to increase participation for people with physical impairments?
So yeah, the main thing, as we said, there's not just one thing, but maybe what everybody could be doing is, if we're saying we need a systems level approach to tackling these barriers, but everybody should be taking the responsibility, perhaps within the organisation that they're in, the sport and physical activity opportunities that they partake in, to be more inclusive. So if I give you an example, if we think about in our university institutions, we know the importance of positive physical activity messages about being inclusive, etc. However, we also know that our sport and exercise science students, if we take them as a population, we think about in the curriculum, how much are we teaching them about disability sport? How much are we perpetuating ableist notions about what, the people who are physically active and sports in our curriculum, and changing or improving the experiences that our students can have with disabled people as part of the curriculum. And if we have a look across sport and exercise science programs as a whole, we see that disability and other inequalities doesn't often feature in our curriculum. We teach a lot of mainstream subjects such as physiology, nutrition, etc., but we focus a lot on our young, able-bodied male athletes within that teaching. So if we think about in our universities, what can we do? We just did a small project which looked at the stories that our sport and exercise students tell about disability, sport and physical activity. And we did that through a method of story completion. So that was where you provide a participant with the start of a story and you ask them to write the end of the story. So we provided some stems about physical activity, about a able-bodied person interacting with a disabled instructor in the gym, and asked the students to write what happened next. And what was really interesting is we saw that a lot of the stories that these students were writing were underpinned by ableist notions about what disabled people can and can't do. And the premise is that a disabled person is incapable of doing a sport and physical activity to the same level as a non-disabled person because of their impairment. And so we're thinking about what can we do? Well, within each of the organisations that we operate in, we need to think about changing the story and promoting more positive messages. So, for example, within curriculums such as sport and exercise science degrees, where these are the next generation of sport, exercise and health practitioners who are potentially going to be supporting and fostering physical activity opportunities for disabled people, we need to make sure that we're raising issues of inequality and social justice, and also providing opportunities for people to understand how to tackle barriers and how individuals themselves can make important differences in the way they interact with disabled people and talk about disabled people in terms of the messages that they're promoting, the conversations they're having. So I think in terms of the main thing that can be done, it is a systems approach. We need, from all areas, we need improvements in getting people more physically active. But on an individual level, we can each think about what's the environment I operate in? How can I take up a mission of social justice and try and improve the sport and physical activity participation for disabled people within the institution I'm in, within the gym I go to, within the sports club I run? And that goes as far as sport and exercise practitioners, gym instructors, coaches, our healthcare professionals, parents. There's a whole group of people that can be taking more positive action to be more inclusive. So I'm not sure if I managed to sidestep your question.
No, I thought that was an excellent answer. I think you did admirably to tackle that, trap-laden question, I think. So well done for doing that. And I think that's a really important point. So you've got the macro level about the systems approach, and then you've got the micro level looking at the individual and the fact that we can all be advocates in our day-to-day life. And that can obviously take different shapes and forms. But if we are advocates for being more inclusive and being more disability aware, hopefully that will filter through into kind of small changes which then aggregate into bigger changes alongside the systems approach that you've highlighted.
I hope so.
Yeah, indeed. Nice kind of positive, powering way to end, I think. So thank you ever so much, Tony. It's been great chatting to you. And I've learned a lot talking to you now. And I hope the listeners have also learned a lot by speaking about physical impairments and sport participation and physical activity opportunities. So thank you ever so much. It'd be great to catch up with you soon.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Our penultimate review of impairment-specific experiences sees us take a virtual trip to Sweden with Dr. Erik Svenelöv to consider intellectual impairments. Welcome, Erik. Thank you for joining the show. Would you be able to kind of describe some research that's been carried out into the grassroots sport participation experiences of individuals with intellectual impairments, please?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. I come from Sweden, and the disability sports grassroots level of Sweden is organized on, ideological level. There is no payment, mostly.
Voluntary.
Voluntary, great. But there are very few clubs on the grassroots level. So there are very few opportunities for people with intellectual disability to take part in sports. And a lot of the research that is going on now is about increasing participation, evaluating and scrutinizing possibilities to participate in sports, but also what is participation? How do you know if a person is participating in something or just being there, so to say? So there's a lot of research going on to sort of determine or define what participation is. But there is also a focus on institutional perspective of disability sports, because most of the people with intellectual disabilities, which I have found and read, are often very dependent on other people's for their opportunities to be part of some kind of sports, some kind of activities, whether it is personal assistance or group homes, or service homes, or, for example, daily activity services. There are often people in a higher position of power that often, in some cases, determines which activities could be appropriate or available. And in some cases, the individuals themselves that can choose between different activities. But there are not so many activities to choose from. For example, if you, like me, love football very much, and perhaps go to the gym and work out, those opportunities may not be present, because if you live in a group home with quite of institutional character, there are schedules of what you're doing, which time you're doing it, and you also have daily activity services where you go to these services or activities, for example, 4 times a day at a specific time, and there's transport to and from there. There are not so much room for example, football, going to the gym, because you're dependent on other people for the activity. For participation in sport, it requires a lot of engagement and effort from the individual itself, but also from the surrounding society and also the social care around the individual.
What kind of sports are often participated in then by individuals with intellectual impairments? As you've mentioned about the need for support network, and how that potentially then creates a barrier for some individuals, or maybe even some sports. So what sports are commonly participated in?
I would say one of the most common sports, I would say, is floorball, football. I think about the English word athletics. I would say those are the most common sports for people with intellectual disability. When I was conducting my research, I did an article where I interviewed athletes who were part of sport organizations which focused on just people with intellectual disabilities. So I interviewed the athletes and also the leaders, and I found very few sports organizations that just focus on some people with intellectual disabilities. Because mostly there were sports clubs for people with physical disabilities or physical impairments, but not so much for intellectual disability. So the amount of choices that targets intellectual disability is quite few. But I would say floorball and football and athletics are the most common.
Okay, and you mentioned that when you were doing your interviews, doing your research, that when you spoke to sports organizations, it was often probably physical impairments that were kind of being focused on. Why was that the case? And what is it about intellectual impairment that is not appealing or is not part of the focus for these organizations?
When I talk to the leaders about their view of the athletes, I trace back. When I talk to the athletes first, I talk to them about their participation, how they think about sports, about their being an athlete, and they identify themselves as an athletes. They are not disabled athletes, they're athletes. But they said that they were part of disability sports. So they were very aware or had quite a lot of experiences of marginalizations from, say, regular sports, in so to say. But when I talked to the leaders, I said that the athletes, they identify themselves with athletes. It's part of their identity, what they're doing. It makes them feel strong. The leaders didn't acknowledge them as athletes. It was just something that they did, or an activity, or they were having fun. They didn't see them as athletes, but the athletes themselves identify themselves as athletes. I did another research about this, where I've sort of a discourse analysis of how you talk about disability sports, and I found that intellectual disability could be wrapped in cotton, so to say. You try to protect them and not expose them of dangers, so to say. And sports could be one of those ways. Because when I began talking, it was that you were dependent on, for example, staff in the group homes, the activity services, or the people around you to be part of these activities. And when these people around the individual may not like sports, or there are not time for sports, disability sports can be something that could endanger or be potentially harmful in a way. So you sort of wrap in cotton and try to protect the individual. There were also talks about disability as a sort of inconvenience. It was more work, and it was sort of inconvenience that disability was constructed or talked about as an inconvenience. It becomes a problem going to and forth, and what if it hurts itself on disability sport? Who should you call then? And that kind of thing. So you just have to protect, but also it could be viewed as an inconvenience and a problem.
Okay, that's really interesting. So we were talking off air about how in Sweden, perhaps the approach and perception of disability is often medicalized in nature. And that seems to be shining through from what you're talking about in terms of organizations and leaders' approach to providing opportunities for intellectual impairments. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that. I'm a doctor in social work, and one of the main focuses that I have in social work is that we work with a social perspective. But disability services and legislations are based on a sort of a medical diagnosis and a medical perspective, which I, in a way, think is necessary as well. You need to have a sort of categorizations in order to have correct services and availability to certain locations, for example, the activity services or disability sports. But it's what it is that we do with these categorizations that may become a problem. To have the categorization in itself doesn't have to be a problem or pejorative or marginalizing, but what we do with it can be a problem. For example, if we see disability as an inconvenience or a problem when creating opportunities to be part of sport activities, for example. So I would say that there is a medicalized focus, which I think is necessary, but it is how you work with it that can be problematic for the individual.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, from what I'm getting from this conversation is that maybe some organizations aren't necessarily actually speaking with their target group or the individuals they're trying to work with. It is a non-disabled perspective being imposed and kind of being filtered through in terms of attitudes rather than actually thinking about how can we enable and empower these individuals to participate in sport.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Well, when I talked to the athletes and both the leaders, I mean, disability sports, as I have found it when I talk to these people, are built up that you cannot be a part of the regular sports here. That is sort of the discourse or the way you talk about disability. You are deviant, so you cannot be in this place. So we have created another place here, which is a place where you can participate on your terms, I would say, which is a good idea. The idea of the sports organization is to increase participation, self-determination, creating something good. But by doing this binary view of sports, where you have regular sports and disability sports, even if the aim is to provide something good with increased participation, what it does is also to increase segregation between those and also sort of point out individuals. You cannot be part of here, so you are part of there. So being part of disability sport can be both something positive, but also something negative. I mean, it could create a sort of identity of an athlete. You can increase your self-determination and your, I mean, sort of strength in who you are, an expression to be who you want to be. But at the same time, it could be stigmatizing because you're labeled as a disabled athlete or a disabled person. I have an example which connects to the disability sports, how you talk about it and how you segregate it, but it is from daily activity services. And there was a staff walking at the town, and she saw one of the persons that she worked with at the daily activity services. And the staff had her working clothes on. She walked towards this person and greeted her and said, "Hi, how are you?" And the person didn't want to say hello to the staff. She just ignored, and then they awkwardly walked away. And when I talked to the individual that had this the activity services, she said that, but I didn't want to say hello to her at town because she had a working clothes on. She didn't want to be connected to the activity services, and that's because that is a categorization as disabled.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of stigma in the categorization. So that's what I said earlier, that the medical perspective can be good, but what we do with it that is important.
Yes, and it's interesting as well because this is quite a different approach to what we have in the UK. So we've often had the concept of mainstreaming, where it is the non-disabled organisation's responsibility to include both non-disabled and disabled people. Theoretically, that's a good approach, but maybe some organisations implement it well and some perhaps not so well. So it's interesting to have the contrast. And of course, with all these things, it's how you implement them and how you utilise it. In itself, they're not necessarily bad or good, but it can be used in negative or positive ways. And it's just interesting to see that different approaches.
Yeah, because I was wondering, in the UK, there is a lot of focus on the social view of disability.
Social model, yeah.
Yeah, and in Sweden, there's a lot of focus on the relational model, where you sort of acknowledge, I mean, the medical and social model. I mean, both have their pros and cons. My view is more towards a social model or cultural model of disability, but I would say that disability politics in Sweden is built upon the relational model.
Yeah, and obviously the influence and importance of policy shines through. You know, if it's being set up from the top, then the actors are going to be implementing the policy that has been set from above. So yeah, they're really interesting. So when we look at grassroots sport participation itself, what are the kind of experiences that go on for individuals with intellectual impairments? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? What are the enablers? Are you able to kind of speak about those kind of points?
One of the big things of being part of this skill sport, which is just wonderful when I went to different sports clubs and talked to them. I mean, it was the love that they expressed of identity construction, being able to express who I want to be and what I want to do. And these are for the individuals that had the opportunities to be part of these skill sports. And these people often had families that were very supportive, or school environments that were very supportive, and also presented different opportunities to be part of these skill sports. But the one thing that is an identity that these skill sports provides. It is both an individual identity, finding yourself, but also sort of a collective identity. One of the athletes that I interviewed said that, well, in these skill sports, everybody can participate no matter what. And that is something that I didn't really find when I talked to the leaders, because their focus was on having fun and don't pressure the individuals, where the individuals themselves, I mean, they competed, they were athletes. So there were so different views of what being an athlete really is. I wrote a Swedish article about this, which is titled Two-Edged Sword, where the disability sports is constructed as something that could be positive, but also negative. It could be invigorating, but also negative. It could strengthen your identity of being an athlete and, as I said, being who you want, but also stigmatizing. You're being labeled as disabled.
So just from what you're telling me, there's a lot of benefits for the individual. That's clear. You focused quite a lot on the identity construction. However, that idea, that thought, doesn't seem to be pervasive in the minds of those who provide sport opportunities or could provide sport opportunities. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we communicate that actually it's not a risky enterprise? It's not about danger. Let's turn it around and make it more of a positive thing. And actually, look, we can provide benefits to these individuals, and we should be providing sport participation opportunities. How do we bridge that gap, do you think?
I've thought about this a lot, and also try to answer one of these questions in my dissertation. And the simple answer is sort of talk about it. Talk about what disability is, talk about what being an athlete is, talk about how you see yourself, and talk about how others see other people. But one of the sort of boring answers is resources also.
Yes.
Because disability sports, there are some researchers, and I have also found it that disability sports and sports in general tend to have quite a low status within social care, because you focus on the care aspect of social rather than the social aspects of social care. So one of the main things is to increase the knowledge about what sports can do, the knowledge about benefits that sports can do within social care. I know that just in my department here that sports is not a big part of social care or social work for that matter either, even though there are so much research about the benefits of sports, whether it is physical, psychological, social benefits. So talk about what sports does, but also it needs to happen on a higher political level in terms of resources for different social care interventions, for example, daily activity services, group homes, personal assistance, because those are often enablers or gateways to different sports activities.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's not just going to be a one solution thing. You've got to also focus on it quite holistically, broadly. And as you said, there's the social aspects, there's the environment, there's also, of course, the organizations, etc. So this question is probably going to be quite hard to answer then. So I apologize in advance. What is the main thing that needs to be done to increase participation for people with intellectual impairments? It's a tricky one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of research going on now that sort of try to distinguish what experiences of disability and experiences of being part of different activities. I think these kind of researches are great because they increase the social awareness in community about what disability is. But also one thing that I focus a lot on is commercials, everyday talk, TV series, how disability is depicted in everyday community, because that also increases the awareness of individuals. I start my dissertation with the word idiot because that was the way of talking about people in not so long ago. And it has happened so much in the recent years, but it can happen so much more. So sort of increased awareness. And I really don't know how explicit how to do it, because it needs to happen, as I said earlier, on a higher political level in sort of resources. But what we can do is talk about it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And what you're talking about actually is kind of just led me to another question, if I can be so bold to ask you another one. How do you think intellectual impairment is seen compared to other impairment groups or other disabilities? And how does that influence the sport participation that is available?
I would say that it has a lower status than other kind of impairments or disabilities.
Why would that be?
One of the reasons is what I said earlier, that you are sort of wrapped in cotton. Disability becomes an inconvenience. It can become sort of a problem when you're doing things, because from a normative perspective, you deviate from intellectual or cognitive ideals of how an ideal human should be. And that is sort of a horrific way to look at disability, just seeing that you are sort of a normative deviant. And you focus so much on what the individual cannot do, so you forget to look on what the individual can do. And that is also one way that you could sort of, with your previous question, change perspective on how you look at things. So if you focus rather on what the individual can do rather than what you cannot do, that is also one of the things that enables or hinders availability to take part in disability sports, whether you focus on what the individual can do or what you cannot do.
Is there any kind of positive work that you'd like to highlight in terms of what's going on at the ground level in terms of sport participation opportunities and experiences?
Try to think a lot. My research obviously is really good. My research focuses more of the processes of categorizations and labeling people, which is a big part of sports. If we look at Special Olympics or those kinds of work, there are categorization in different competitive categories within that. So categorizations, labeling on a grassroots level or social care level is also important for disability sports. So how we are working and talking about the labeling process and categorization process is a big part. But I don't have any specific names or something like that, but there are great research that focuses on this kind of labeling categorization processes. If you look at, for example, able-mindedness and those kind of things. One of those things that really inspired me when I started to look upon disability sports and how it experiences is able-mindedness, what is an able body and what is a disabled body or something like that.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot there. Is there anything you'd like to finally add before we close our discussion for today?
Just be open and talk about different things, but also be reflexive about how you talk about it and why you talk about it. So you have a sort of agenda and idea with your talk. And be open for other people's perspective.
Yes, I think that's really important and a really great point to end. Be open-minded. That's the best way to have progress, hopefully. Well, Eric, thank you so much. It's been great chatting with you and great to have this conversation about intellectual impairments and the experiences in Sweden. So thank you so much, and it's great to catch up, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. The final impairment group discussion is on deaf sport. Chris Price and Rebecca Foster, MBE, join me to discuss the sport participation experiences of individuals with a hearing impairment. I'm delighted to be joined by Rebecca Foster, MBE, and Chris Price from the West Bromwich Albion Football Foundation. Welcome, Rebecca, and Chris, thank you for speaking with me today. To begin, please can you describe the research that's been carried out into the sport participation experiences of deaf or hard of hearing individuals?
First of all, Christopher, thank you very much for giving us this platform to actually share some of our knowledge, and hope that it will be helpful to anybody that listens or everybody that listens. I'll be very brutally honest and say that as far as research in deaf studies goes, full stop, is very limited, especially with deaf sport. So a lot of the papers are currently somewhat dated. Still, the message is very, very important, but they are looking at the 1990s, 1980s. So David Stewart was a very key person, Martin Atherton, a number of great authors, deaf sport in particular, especially around the Deaf Olympics, or silent games as they used to be known. I think there's more people that are looking at globally socialisation of sport. So myself, Professor Hayley Fitzgerald and Dr. Annette Stride looked at the socialisation of deaf people in sport. But I think to probably make it more accessible for people who are interested in reading about deaf sport in particular, there's a cracking book called Same Spirit, Different Team, and it is the politicalisation of the Deaf Olympics, and it was written by Stuart Harrison, who is very much embedded within the deaf community and has bags of experience for Deaf Olympics, deaf sport, etc. But it's not a hard and fast academic text, but I would recommend it because he goes back, is probably one of the first pieces of historical data for UK deaf history that would be maybe of interest for people. I know I certainly found it interesting.
Why do you think there's not been much research then into the experiences of deaf or hard of hearing individuals and their sport participation?
From my perception, it's an area of disability that is often very hidden. We're living in a very ableist world where it's very difficult sometimes to actually notice who may have a hearing impairment or deaf. And I think because there's no physical attributes to that, I think a lot of hearing people might make the assumption that, well, you just muddle along, don't you? There's nothing different, nothing wrong, nothing disadvantage. Whereas, of course, there is actually a lot of balance issues. There's lots of sort of developmental of understanding concepts that might be compromised as well because the language or communication system might be slightly delayed. And so I think people have often made the assumption that there isn't necessarily a great need. But of course, as I work with a lot of students, there is need because it's about giving a voice to particular groups as well. So I do think it is often overlooked because there's other more, for the want of a better word, sexier disabilities that people want to get to grips with. I don't know, Chris, if that's true for you at all.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Because it's more forgotten about that perception that hearing impaired can just fit in with mainstreams. There's not that need to research as much, and I think for obviously someone with a hearing impairment, we haven't got that voice because we haven't got that platform because we're not as equally represented as probably other disabilities. So again, I use the example of the Deaf Olympics against the Paralympics. You look at the funding gaps, you look at the voice that Paralympians have compared to Deaf Olympians. There's just not that platform for people with a hearing impairment to actually say, do you know what, there's something wrong here, and have that focus on them for others to think, oh, actually, we need to change that. As much as you have sort of Paralympians highlighting the disadvantages they might have, other difficulties they might face with sort of hearing impairment, it's just that perception that for me, once I put my hearing aids in, I can just get on with life. I haven't got that voice because they'll say, well, you're not actually disabled, are you? Because you can just put your hearing aids in and you can cope with the world more so than someone with a visual impairment or a physical impairment where it's a lot more obvious.
Okay, so there's probably an issue in terms of the involvement and perhaps sidelining of people who have hearing impairments or who are culturally deaf. So we've looked at elite sport and we've discussed how the funding is primarily allocated to Paralympic sport from UK sport. What about grassroots sport? So when we're looking at grassroots sport experiences for those individuals with hearing impairments, what's it like? From your perspective, Chris, but also you, Rebecca, too.
For me, I think parents are by far the biggest decider of grassroots for deaf individuals. For me, I obviously work in the disability department. My kind of role is to get children with a hearing impairment to disability-specific sessions. Parents can either help or hinder. depending on their own perception. So for me, my upbringing was that I was kind of almost turned away from deaf sport. It was kind of just, again, let him get into mainstream, let him fit into mainstream. If he can get into mainstream, there's more opportunities. That kind of reflected on my grassroots football experience. So I then played mainstream football. It was very mainstream experience. Now I'm kind of on the flip side. I can see that replicated. So parents are, if they are oral, so if they don't sign, then they're very much kind of, well, let's just get them into mainstream team, let's get them into a mainstream football team. If they sign, then straight away they're going to mainstream sessions, they're getting turned away because coaches are not deaf aware, coaches can't sign, they can't communicate, they're almost pushed to the side, and then they come to our SEND sessions, so where we have the awareness and the ability to communicate with them. So it's kind of, if they fail at mainstream, they then go down the disability route more so than they will instantly go to that sort of that disability specific session. However, if they do sign, then they go into the almost like the deaf culture, which has been set up so they're just hearing impairment specific sessions.
Thanks, Chris. Anything to add, Rebecca?
Well, I think access to sport is, again, it very much determines, I think, as Chris is right, on the parents or the carers that might be able to take the child there. But I think clubs and schools have got a point to play within that, because if the teachers don't know about other opportunities that the children can go to. So I know, I'll be honest, that when I was teaching in schools as a young 22-year-old, I didn't actually know the Deaf Olympics existed. So therefore, I wasn't in a position to promote Deaf Olympics, even though I may have had people in my class who were hearing impaired or were deaf. So I think our job is to raise awareness in schools and clubs, in able to give children who are losing their hearing or gaining deafness, I like to say, as a way to perhaps say that you can perhaps dip your toe in mainstream opportunities, also see and embrace your deaf identity by going towards more specialist deaf sports. But I think the profile is incredibly low for deaf sports. And I think Chris is right. If you're good enough as a deaf athlete, you are then expected to go into the mainstream ether. But really the opportunity for that regarding communication, and even for my sport, for athletics, hearing the call out for events, having that one-to-one with coaches that might not feel comfortable in being able to communicate and articulate, all of these things as a hearing person, we think that's normal. We'll access it, but it does prove to be a barrier for people who are not able to hear. So I think the opportunity is somewhat more challenging, not impossible, but challenging, but can be easily remedied by teachers promoting other disability sports, whether or not they be an athlete with short stature, child with Down syndrome, Special Olympics, dwarf sports. We've got all of these, but it's just a question of raising that profile.
You've both talked about the children angle, but what about adults? In terms of their sport participation experiences, is there anything that differs from the experiences of children and what you've talked about so far?
No. I think one of the deaf Olympians who did extremely well in Taipei was a 40-year-old woman who'd only just come to know about deaf sport and was a bronze medal winner. And she said, the only reason I found out about Deaf Olympics is through Facebook. And so I think the culture, even when we come back from Deaf Olympics, media coverage is very low. So I think, again, that our culture of an ableist culture, if you've got a hearing impairment and going into a very dominant hearing culture, it takes quite a lot of self-esteem and confidence to be able to walk into that if you're a lone hearing impaired person. So I think it probably gets more difficult, not unless you're part of a community that might go and access a club together. That's from my point of view when I've done outreach work in the community for deaf groups, but I don't know what you think, Chris.
The one thing that stands out for me is I think adults that are more culturally aware of their entitlements are very quick to highlight that. So, for example, when we worked with a deaf men's team, they were very quick to highlight that we didn't have a proper interpreter. We kind of just put in myself and obviously a couple of other coaches that knew basic sign language, and then we used the non-verbal communicators like whiteboards and sort of hand gestures, but there wasn't that knowledge of being able to interpret, to have a conversation. So a lot of what our sessions were very heavily football based, as opposed to having that general conversation that you might have with Grassroots, because I think the children may have grown up just, you've got to get used to it, you've got to cope, you've got to adapt, look into what everyone else is doing and copy that. Whereas I think with adults, they would, if they're aware of what they're entitled to, they're very quick to say, well, there's not an interpreter in place, or you can't communicate with me, we don't understand.
Okay, so adults perhaps are more aware of the barriers, potentially are more confident to challenge the barriers that they may experience, whereas, again, if we're generalising, for children, perhaps it's more just they want to participate, they want to play. Perhaps they might copy what they see other children doing just to fit in and maybe just get along with it. Whereas adults, and of course it won't be all adults, might be more empowered to speak up and challenge any barriers that they are experiencing or any discrimination they might be facing. Okay, so we've talked about some of the challenges. So what needs to happen to then facilitate increased grassroots sport participation for people with a hearing impairment or those who are deaf? I'll go to you first, Rebecca, and then we'll go to you, Chris, as a final comment on this particular question.
I think a very simple aspect that can be considered is that of deaf awareness. I think if any club member was able to be a little bit more deaf aware and how to greet someone that might have a hearing impairment into their club, and just show them the routine, explain maybe one-to-one why they need to, this is where they go, etc., and introduce them to key people, I think it would be ideal. And it's sort of like looking at people's attitudes. So I do think if we demystified the myth of not every deaf person uses signs, some people have some level of hearing, make sure that you face them, there's no light behind you, like glaring light in their eyes. All of these simple things could be all of a sudden empower a hearing person to think, oh, I can do that. And if my face is very welcoming about coming into a club and my body language is possible, you don't necessarily need to sign to that degree. So I think, and that is an example of being deaf aware, and just be open-minded. I think school teachers need to promote the Deaf Olympics, but I think they need to promote all different avenues of disability sport also. But I think with what we do at university, what we do in our daily lives is to speak up. So if we do see an element of someone that's trying to hear someone and they've got a face mask on, it's okay to sort of say, oh, shall I take my mask down? Or would you like me to, can I help in any way? And if that person requires help, they'll say, yeah, okay, I could do with a bit of help. Or they'll say, no, thank you. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do in our own little corner in ourselves, but in the community of with which we operate as well. That's what I think. I don't know about yourself, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say awareness is massive. I think it's demystifying those perceptions that someone with a hearing aid can't hear, or in terms of can't communicate with someone. So just because they've got a hearing aid doesn't mean that they instantly know sign language. It doesn't mean that they can't hear anything at all. It's just kind of flipping it and think, well, actually they can hear, but it's the sounds that they don't know are there, they can't hear. That's a big one for me. Sort of the first thing is that, oh, okay, I've got hearing aid, that means I can't hear. Well, actually, I can hear. I can't hear everything, but I can hear. So it's kind of demystifying some of those elements, as well as obviously just raising that awareness of actually, we're not alien, we're not completely different. We can actually still lead, the same lives as everyone else. We can still communicate, whether it just takes a little bit extra, whether it just means writing something down, whether it means using, similar hand gestures you can. So, for example, if you don't know the sign for cup of tea in sign language, you might just kind of, mimic a cup, you might mimic a drink. You might spell it in with your fingers. Just having that awareness in the back of their mind of actually they don't understand what's being said, but they might not necessarily want to raise that.
Okay then, so what is the main thing that needs to be done to increase grassroots sport participation for individuals with a hearing impairment or who are culturally deaf? And do we need to distinguish between individuals who are culturally deaf and those with a hearing impairment?
What more can be done? Unfortunately, could be quite controversial in as much as that, because there are very few specialist deaf schools now, a lot of children are in mainstream education. And whereas before, when there was a hearing impaired unit, you would get a lot of children with hearing impairments together. And that could almost be a ready-made school, after-school team or club, socialisation, friendship groups. And what I'm finding now is because of the mainstream setup, there may be only one hearing impaired or deaf child in a school, two in another. And therefore, that kind of socialisation is really sort of been watered down. So hearing impaired children are kind of probably forced only to go into the mainstream field. And again, a lot will be able to benefit hugely from that. But I think to also know that there is a deaf sport pathway could really be the making of someone's deaf identity as well. And I think that just still needs to be publicised. So through UK Deaf Sport website, there are social events, there are some community groups that also meet together to try and sort of reinvigorate participation levels. But I think any child going to a mainstream environment is exactly the right thing to do, despite the fact that they might be sometimes alienated because not everybody knows sign language or what have you. I think to stay in mainstream, but also investigate the deaf pathways as well. To reiterate, I think schools have got a part to play on that. I think our media have a part to play on that. But I think mainly, for me, from the youth, it starts at school. So I think if children know that they have got options and opportunity, I think there will be more growth for deafness, specifically in sport.
I think for me, it's having that platform. I almost envision it as a circle. If we give deaf athletes and deaf participants a voice, then society will listen. Therefore, they will get louder. Society will be more aware, and it's almost having that circle in a way. I think at the moment, there's a clash of people with a hearing impairment trying to speak up, getting nowhere and thinking, well, what's the point? No one's going to listen. So then you get the flip side of the mainstream going, oh yeah, I'm deaf aware. Yeah. My nan's deaf, or I know one person that's deaf. Well, yeah, but that's only one. So, for example, don't base everything off me, because there's millions of people out there that have a different deafness to me. So don't just obviously having that assumption. When I thought about this question, it's having that platform, but then being listened to. So it works both ways. Obviously, athletes are trying to speak up and raise awareness, but they're not being heard. And when they're starting to get heard, for example, we look at obviously the sign language bill that's now going through. It's raising awareness. When we do Deaf Awareness Week, they might be, oh yeah, that's really good. The following week, there's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think with more role models, in as much as Rosie or Strictly Come Dancing, etc., all of those aspects raise awareness in a different way.
Any final points you'd like to add, Chris?
Just about funding. So obviously, I think there's deaf athletes out there that are trying to raise awareness but aren't being heard. So, for example, you've got Deaf Olympians that are trying to raise awareness for the Deaf Olympics. For example, there's one member that's been speaking for over a year. He's got a very strong voice, but he's not getting heard. He's not getting that recognition. And I think at some point he will think, what's the point? And that's another voice lost. Myself, for example, I can speak about deaf awareness as much as possible, but people have got to listen as well on the same side.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's really been great catching up with you guys, and I look forward to catching up with you soon. Thank you very much. Our final discussion explores the Accessercise app, a fitness app specifically designed for people with impairments. I caught up with Ali Jawad to learn more. So you've created the Accessercise app. First of all, what is it? And why have you created this app? What's its purpose?
So I'll give you some context behind it, because I think it's important that we get some context behind it. So in the first lockdown, like everyone else, I had more times on my hands. And I was training for a Paralympic Games for my living room. So yeah, it's crazy. But I think what I did was I was kind of reflecting on my career at the time, thinking like, did I do enough? Did I reach my potential? Have I achieved everything that I wanted to? Just stuff like that. Like a reflective period for me. It's weird, but I think everyone was reflecting, I think, in that time. But the one thing that, when I look back, it wasn't about the medals or what I did. It was actually why I never questioned why I was the only disabled person in a gym at the time. I never questioned it. I never asked that question. And when I look back, I was like, why did I never ask somebody why? Is it because I was just more adaptable because I wanted to get to the Paralympic Games and I just got on with it? Or were there barriers there that I just didn't understand? And has that really changed in the last 17 years since then? There's more disabled people going to gyms and actually regularly going. And the answer was, I don't think so. So I thought, well, why is that the case? So I went online and I thought, well, there must be a fitness app that caters for disabled people or people with impairments, because the fitness app industry is huge. It is massive. I think there's over 70,000 health and fitness apps on the market. I was like, there's bound to be one. So I did my research one morning and I couldn't find one. Now I thought, this is shocking. Am I not looking in the right places, or does it not exist? So as a disabled person, I started writing things down in terms of if there was a fitness app, what would it look like? And then within the hour, I was like, okay, I think I've got a fitness app here. So I thought, yeah, but don't be stupid. Like, you've got no business or tech experience. Like, rip it up and throw it in the bin. Like, that's just like another project when you retire or something. But then I was like, you know what? Like, it needs to happen. And why should I let somebody else do it? I think I can do it. Like, I'm a disabled person, like, I've got the experience. Why not? So I called my friend and now my co-founder to tell me off to see whether or not it's crazy or whether or not I'm onto something. And he was like, oh my God, let's do it. The idea to launch, it took us about a year. And last year we launched it. So Accessercise is, well, I guess it's the world's first complete fitness app, especially designed for people with disabilities and impairments.
So you did that all whilst training for the Paralympics via your living room?
And studying the PhD at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot about your PhD. The whole reasons we were talking, yeah.
For my sins.
Okay. Yeah, you obviously like having lots of things to do at the same time. But yeah, okay, excellent. You've created this really, world-leading app. So if someone logs onto it, what do they see? What do they find in this app?
Yeah, so we try to kind of cater with 3 different features in the app. So feature 1 is the exercise library. This is a impairment-specific exercise video library where the user gets a catalogue of video exercises performed by somebody of their impairment.
Okay.
Right? So if you're a double amputee, all the videos, the demonstrator is a double amputee too. Now, we don't give out any training programs at all because I'm not an expert on every impairment. However, the user is an expert on their impairment. So with the video exercises, users can create their own training programs, right? So you empower them, you educate them, but they also take responsibility of their journeys, which I think is really important, and not relying on able-bodied people to teach them what to do. The second feature is the social hub, where users get to share their workouts with their friends, and their friends can like, comment, and motivate them. Because I think a sense of community is really important. And the last one, and this is where my academic science evidence-based hat comes on. I thought, well, how can I change the fitness industry itself? Like, how can we drive to better policy changes down the line? So the explore section allows users to rate the accessibility of gyms and sporting facilities in their areas, which means that it's a two-way feedback. It allows users to know what facilities are quote unquote, accessible for them, or the most accessible for them. But two, it allows us to know what gyms and sporting facilities are lacking, which means that actually, when it comes to analysing our fitness industry in the UK, we've actually got actual data from actual users to drive our thinking. And I think that's really important. So they're the three main features. Obviously, we've got other features, but they're the three where we think will make a huge difference to the app.
Okay, yeah, really interesting. And in terms of the last point, so about the accessibility and users being able to rate it, are you working with gyms to try and promote the app so that they open themselves up to being critiqued, or are you hoping that the users themselves do that and you kind of then go to the gyms and say, look, this is what the feedback we're getting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So at the moment, because we're so new, we're relying on users. However, in the future, we're absolutely going to work with gyms to make sure that if they do have a favorable rating, we help them make sure that we increase their rating. Remember, the ratings in the app, they're not driven by me or my team. They're driven by the user. So it's not us criticizing, it's the user themselves. And I thought that was really important. And in the app, if a facility gets more than 4 stars, they automatically get our logo on it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. That's nice.
It's like a verified. It's like a verified thing unofficially, and I thought that was a good thing to do. So you separate the accessible gyms and the non-accessible gyms on the map.
Yeah, then you hope that some gyms who haven't got the logo strive to do it, especially if it's a local competitor, etc. Okay, cool. You probably know this already because you're a very smart man and you've done your research in this area. English Federation of Disability Sport, which is now Activity Alliance, they had something called the Inclusive Fitness Initiative, which not as detailed as what you've created, but they also had the kind of mark of quality and trying to say that these are the gyms which are inclusive. Why has that not translated to meaningful change then?
Do you want my honest opinion?
I would love your honest opinion, yeah.
Let's just say organisations that preach about participation, I'm not going to say who because I think we know who they are, that are government funded, they love consultation. They love data in terms of the statistics behind a certain problem, and they commit to funding projects to say they've done something to address it without actually addressing the problem.
Okay.
So these organizations have the resources to do this app. This app should have been created years ago. With the resources that some government agencies have, they've got the money to do it. They've got the know-how. They can do it. They can't. For me to kind of do this myself just shows you that nobody actually wants meaningful change. It's all about ticking loads of boxes. So that's the problem. You've got organizations that have loads of money behind them, talking about, consultations, and, producing data that actually don't correspond to any change at all.
Yeah, so it's a tick box culture. And I think also, you probably, again, know more than me about this, but these are organizations that are run by non-disabled people primarily.
They are.
Right. So, yes, they may want to change it, but they don't have the lived experience. They don't necessarily have that.
Yeah, but I think that's an excuse, because I keep saying to a lot of people, how many disabled people do you know are employed in senior positions in any organizations?
Well, hardly any, presumably.
Why?
Well, why? Yeah, exactly. Probably because, there's a lack of fairness or awareness of the opportunities that exist.
It's because organizations think to tick a box on their accessibility and inclusion space as an organization. They think employing a disabled person in a low-skilled job is enough, because that's apparently. I mean, we have to be appreciative that we even got a job. That has to change.
That patronising attitude that we talked about earlier.
Massively. So I think we're getting to a point where we need to allow the disabled community to demonstrate their ability rather than giving them low-level jobs as a tick box exercise. A lot of organisations that work with disabled people, you're right, they're able-bodied. what do they know? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and if you are able-bodied, it's also about giving a platform to individuals who have that experience and have the knowledge, and actually be humble enough to say, yeah, I don't know all the answers. I don't have all the experience or knowledge. Someone else might do. It's interesting you're talking about that because it's dreadful that 2022. This is taken now. It's like last year, that we've had an app like this.
And done by somebody with no tech or business experience. Some random dude.
Well, you're not quite some random dude, Ali. You're a very successful elite athlete. But your point remains. It's taken an individual with the drive and determination and passion to try and actually get us across the line. But obviously, if you had all the resources and infrastructure that some other organisations have, you'd be able to implement this even greater, of course.
Yeah, there's global companies out there that could do this. They could have done it years ago.
Of course.
So for me, it's a travesty that it's taken, one or two people to have an idea, thought about during lockdown to actually do it. Like, we haven't got the resources like anybody else. So we've had to think outside the box. But I think the way we've done it has actually been a benefit to us because I am disabled. I've got the experience as a disabled person. So having that know-how has actually probably been better for the app rather than an organisation doing it instead.
Yeah, and what you said earlier kind of struck me when you talk about the consultation exercises that some organisations go through. When I was doing my PhD, I had to do a freedom of information request to get information about Sport England funding for disability amongst national governing bodies, because they said £91.5 million or whatever has gone to national governing bodies. Like, okay, where is it then? Where's it gone? And it took a bit of time. And then some of the funding was basically for having the conversation, for basically trying to upskill organisations, saying, let's work towards having the opportunity to be able to do it. And it wasn't actually funding for a project, really. It was just about, let's try and upskill you guys. It's just crazy.
I think it's important that you upskill your staff. Absolutely, it's important.
That shouldn't be the end result of a funding from
that should not be the end result.
No.
It should be part of the process.
Yeah, and often some of the accusations from other participants was that essentially some organisations go for the easy wins in terms of the impairment categories, like try and have these big mass sessions where you get maybe intellectual impairment groups, so you can just say, look how what we're doing, rather than actually, again, trying to make meaningful change. Yeah,
because the app's still in its early days. We are going to try and cater for about 126 disabilities and impairments in the app eventually.
Really, I was going to ask you, how have you made it accessible across the multiple impairments? How are you? It's 126. That's a lot. How have you managed to kind of get all the exercise videos and experience and information? That must have been a big piece of work.
Yeah, our biggest challenge is content, right? So think about it. Every impairment has its own content, and that content has to start from novice all the way up to experienced. And so the intensity of the exercises obviously then varies as well. So you're catering, not only for every impairment, but you're also catering for the level of that user and their journeys. So you have to have enough, the content will be vast per impairment eventually. So we focused on physical impairment for now. And then we're going to branch out to more impairments down the line. So eventually we're going to have chronic illnesses. We're going to have, things that are invisible illnesses as well. The dream is to make it the most accessible fitness app there has ever been. That is the goal. I know it's a huge goal. I know it's crazy because it's still early days and, my team's only 3 people. But the dream is to get to that sort of level because, as an elite athlete, I've always said that the dream is to always get to an Olympic and Paralympic Games. That's what it is as an athlete. And for me, I need to transfer that into, business and go, actually, what is the dream? What is the pinnacle? And the pinnacle is you make it as accessible as physically possible.
Yeah, it's just frustrating you haven't had the resources, or someone else with a huge amount of resources haven't been able to kind of add to this. You should go on Dragon's Den next season.
No, they take too much equity.
Yeah, that's the problem. You'll value your business at $1 million and say, I only want 5% giveaway, and they're about, what's going on?
Yeah, exactly. They probably want 50%. But if Stephen Bartlett is listening, I'll have a conversation with him because I think he can do good things for us.
If only I knew Stephen Bartlett. But you never know. He might be one of our listeners. Who knows? But
or Peter Jones, because he's techie.
Yeah. Or any of Dragon. If you've got expertise and you're listening, feel free to get in touch. But okay. So there's obviously the challenges are in terms of time, resources, being able to get it as accessible as possible. So for now, you're working with users and you're hoping the users generate the content and then you can feed that back. How do you envisage working with organizations if possible? We've talked about how in the future you can maybe go to gyms, etc. how are you going to get this message about this app out there? What's your kind of main way of doing that?
Yeah, so I'm going to correct you there for a minute. It's not the users, so it's not users creating content for us at all.
So I meant in terms of the rating. I meant in terms of
you mean the explore section? Okay.
Yeah.
So our plan is to basically partner with every single charity that represents these impairments.
Okay.
And become their like a official fitness app partner to make sure that we work with them to make sure the exercises in the app are safe, are accessible, and they're doing the job that we think they should be doing for their communities. So we're asking charities that represent these impairments to contact me so we can work together. And because like from the start, the exercises in the app, I knew that obviously being an elite athlete, my knowledge is vast by the top level. I needed some grounding, what was going on the ground. So what I did was, from the very, very start of the process, I employed a disability focus group with varying impairments to go through the process with me at every stage, to make sure that the app is functioning, the flow of the app is accessible enough, the videos are clear, they're concise, and all the features were doing what they're supposed to. So that knowledge that I had from the focus group was very valuable for us. And I'm adding to that focus group every single time we get a new impairment in to make sure that we've got fresh ideas, fresh perspectives. So yeah, we've got a big focus group that's helped me do it. But I know that we can do way more. So I'm hoping that charities and organisations come forward. And we're hoping that universities as well come forward to make sure that they do research on the app. Make sure that, from an evidence point of view, it's doing what it's supposed to do. And actually we're open to any sort of improvements as well. So we want the app to be as evidence-based as possible.
So yeah, lots of work ahead. What would be kind of the main piece of work now for the next 6 months or so? Is it just getting the content for the videos and then refreshing the focus groups? Is that what you're envisaging?
Yeah, the biggest thing for us is content, right? The app doesn't exist without video content. It's just how it is. Unfortunately, that video content, as you can imagine, is stupidly expensive. You've got the cost of the facility, you've got the cost of, however, we managed to get, Stoke Man have been incredible for us. They've allowed us to film for free there in the beginning, which was great. But you've got the, camera operator, you've got the editing, you've got the voiceovers in the videos. It is a very expensive process for us. And I guess with any tech company, it's going to burn a lot of money. We're not going to be different. So yeah, for us, it's all about getting as much content as possible and growing the impairment groups, because it's only going to work if you cater for the majority of the community. So for us, we've got a long way to go still.
And in terms of platforms it's available on, is it on Android, iOS, all those kind of platforms?
Yeah, it's available on both. And yeah, you can find us on all our social media platforms too.
For those who aren't technologically savvy, how can they still be exercising and be keeping themselves fit if they're not able to if they don't have a phone that is able to download this app? How are you going to try and help those individuals?
Yes, I think down the line, we're going to try revamp our website where it becomes the app. So you can download stuff offline and access it later on demand. Obviously, that's the dream down the line. And it's also very important we do that because we know that not everyone's got a phone, especially if we want to branch out to other nations. So it's important that people can download it without using their phones. They can use it through a screen. And we're going to try and make it as accessible as possible eventually. But yeah, please be patient with us. It's been a very long process already.
Yeah, I think listeners will be very patient based on all the work that you're currently doing. Well, that's really been very interesting to learn about this app. Accessercise app available via Google Play and also via iOS on Apple. So please download it. There's also the website. Would you like to say the website address?
Yeah, it's just accessercise.com.
Cool. And to confirm, Accessercise is spelled ACCESSERCISE.
Yep.
Okay, Ali, that's been great. It's been great chatting to you. Lots of content, very interesting. You're a very busy man, so I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's it. That's all we have time for. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Disability Sport Info Show. Stay tuned for another episode. Until then, goodbye. You've been listening to the Disability Sport Info Show, academic insights into disability sport.